Big Time Wrestling was a promotion based out of San Francisco, California that operated from 1960 until 1981. Founded by former professional wrestler Roy Shire in 1960 in direct competition of what was left of Joe Malsowitz's NWA promotion, which dominated the territory since 1935 and lasted until 1962. Originally considered an outlaw promotion because he did not respect the territorial boundaries set by the National Wrestling Alliance, he eventually joined the NWA by 1968. It ran shows in the Cow Palace, and in 1961, Shire secured a time slot from the independent Oakland TV station KTVU. With bookers Red Bastian and Johnny Doyle, the promotion depended on high spots and realistic matches to obtain years of sellout crowds, eventually expanding into Sacramento, Fresno, Las Vegas, and even Anchorage, Alaska. Stars that came through the area included Harley Race, Ray Stevens, Dean Ho, Playboy Buddy Rose, Pat Patterson, Don Morocco, Moondog Mayne, and even a young Roddy Piper. By the late 1970s, crowds started to dwindle, and in 1980, Roy Shire suffered a heart attack and retired in early 1981. The promotion suffered its final death blow when Vern Gagne's AWA began promoting shows in the area during their attempt to expand nationally. Years later, a resentful Roy Shire broke kayfabe in a newspaper article claiming every match he promoted was staged. This is the untold story of Big Time Wrestling San Francisco.
Original wrestling documentaries. What the world has come to.
It was 1911. As the first old age home was opening in Prescott, Arizona, Ottawa Senators beat Port Arthur Bearcats 13-4 to win the Stanley Cup. The Mona Lisa is stolen by Vincenzo Peruggia, and Frank Gotch faced Henry Ordman at the Dreamland Rink to a disappointing house which drew under 500 people, which also marked the first organized wrestling match in the area. Although the fans were less than enthusiastic to watch the match, most just came for a glimpse of world champion Frank Gotch. During the time, matches were promoted by Frank Carter, who promoted matches all over the country and would regularly book both boxing and wrestling matches on the same card. Crowds began to rise in attendance, and in 1916, Ed Strangler Lewis defeated Ad Santel in front of 7,000 fans in the Civic Auditorium. Other mat stars that came through the area around this time included Stanislaus Sabisco, the Greek demon William Demetrol, Charlie Cutler, and Peter Bazukos. 1917 was seen as one of the most tragic years up until this point in the world of professional wrestling. Not only did Frank Gotch pass away at the age of 40 from uremic poisoning, just as attendance began to rise in the area, a drastic move to halt wrestling matches was taken when municipal authorities stated that Ordinance 3361 was amended and a new section known as Section 66 was added, which stated every person, firm, or club who wanted to promote an event would have to pay $50 for each boxing exhibition and $3,000 for every wrestling exhibition just to obtain a permit. Mayor Ralph McLaren, who was ultimately responsible for the decision, stated at first sight, "It may seem there is discrimination between boxing and wrestling matches, but in his eyes, most wrestling matches were bunk. Promoters in the area had no choice but to put a halt on any planned events." In April 1918, the ordinance was revised and wrestling permits would be granted under the same section as circus acts, and wrestling matches would once again be held in the Dreamland Rink, which also held skating, boxing events, church services, and anti-mask meetings. By the end of 1918, wrestling had made a full return to the area in a packed card where Bull Montana faced Tony Bernardi in the main event. Through the early 1920s, attendance was up and down as New York promoters began claiming fixed wrestling matches were more entertaining than real ones. But that didn't stop promoter Frank Schuler from holding regular shows in the newly renovated Dreamland Rink, which was now called the Dreamland Auditorium, which was turned into a seated auditorium, and promoted shows in the area through the 1920s until 1928, when wrestler Jack Ganson took over the lease. The Utica Panther, Joe Malsowitz, was born on March 17, 1897 in Utica, New York. He began wrestling around 1914 and challenged for the World Heavyweight Wrestling Championship on several occasions throughout the 1920s. he retired from professional wrestling at the age of 38 and moved to promoting. In November 1935, he succeeded Jack Ganson as the leaseholder of San Francisco's new Dreamland Auditorium, buying out Ganson's interest for $15,000 after Paul Bowser and Toots Mondt convinced him to step aside. He did his first show on November 26, 1935. Although the promotion's heartland was San Francisco, with the San Francisco Civic Auditorium as its core venue, it also ran shows in other Northern California cities including Fresno, Oakland, Richmond, Sacramento, San Jose, Santa Rosa, Stockton, and Vallejo. And also on occasion, Joe Malsowitz still got into the ring himself. Around 1944, Malsowitz invented the first circular ring, which didn't last long after several complaints. In November of 1949, Malsowitz joined the newly formed National Wrestling Alliance. His promotion became the NWA affiliate for San Francisco, giving Malsowitz an effective monopoly over professional wrestling in the area. He remained a member until 1962, although his membership briefly lapsed in 1956 and 57 when he was late signing the paperwork. Over the course of his membership, Malsowitz sat on both the board of directors and the NWA World Heavyweight Championship Committee. In 1950, Malsowitz created the NWA Tag Team Championship San Francisco version, the second regional NWA Tag Team Championship. Malsowitz built a strong tag team division, with the top stars including brothers Ben and Mike Sharp, who held the championship on 18 occasions. Other teams who held the titles throughout the years included Pepper Gomez and Peter Maivia, Ray Eckert and Hardboiled Haggerty, Superstar Billy Graham and Pat Patterson, Pepper Gomez and Jose Lothario, and Art and Stan Nielsen. In 1951, Malsowitz and 50th State big-time wrestling promoter Al Karasik organized a Shriners Tour of Japan. Malsowitz and Karasik built a strong relationship with Ricky Dozen and his Japan Wrestling Association, with the promoters trading wrestlers across the Pacific. In May 1956, the Sharp brothers briefly lost the San Francisco version of the NWA World Tag Team Championships to Kokichi Endo and Ricky Dozen during a tour of Japan. Bouts between the Sharp brothers and Ricky Dozen provided a patriotic outlet for the citizens of occupied Japan, with the Sharp brothers using villainous tactics against the heroic Ricky Dozen, who would eventually rally to defeat them, drawing chants of "Long Live Japan." Malsowitz regularly recruited athletes from other sports in an attempt to create new stars. Crossover athletes with NWA San Francisco during the 1950s included strongman Doug Hepburn, National Football League players Art Michalek, Gene Liscombe, Leo Nomalini, and Cy Williams. In the late 1950s, one of the top tag teams in the wrestling world was a tag team of the Shire brothers, Professor Roy and his younger brother Ray. At the beginning of 1960, Roy decided he had enough of being a professional wrestler and settled down in the San Francisco Bay Area and decided to start his own wrestling promotion. The American Wrestling Alliance was born. This AWA, of course, was not affiliated with the AWA from the Midwest owned by Vern Gagne. After a serious knee injury, Roy decided to move into promoting in direct competition with Malsowitz, defying the territorial boundaries set by the NWA. In October 1960, he registered the Pacific Coast Athletic Corporation with the California State Athletic Commission over Malsowitz's objections. Joe Malsowitz owned the entire Northern California territory, but was starting to get old and wasn't spending as much time as he used to at work, and crowds at his wrestling shows were not what they used to be. San Francisco and the surrounding territory had been a strong, profitable base of wrestling fans, but it would still take a lot of work to get them into the box office. Roy Shire saw the territory was being neglected. He was anxious to stop wrestling himself and wanted to start promoting. It was easy for any wrestler to see that promoting was where the big money was, and it was a lot easier on the body as well. Shire contacted Malsowitz and told him he wanted to stop wrestling and get into the promotion end of the business. Roy made several offers to Malsowitz to buy the territory or buy in as a partner, but got nowhere. Joe Malsowitz was making a comfortable living as a promoter, and he seemed happy letting his promotion run on remote control. Even though he wasn't working real hard promoting his shows anymore, he was still making money. He also wasn't too worried about Roy Shire. As a member of the National Wrestling Alliance, he owned the Northern California wrestling territory, and unless he wanted to sell it, he didn't anticipate Roy Shire would be successful promoting wrestling in the area. Needless to say, he underestimated Roy Shire, and Roy decided to start an outlaw promotion and run in opposition to Malsowitz's NWA promotion. This has historically been a very risky entry into the business, but Roy had arranged to get money from what he called Eastern investors and made a deal to use television tapes and wrestlers from a promotion located in the Midwest. Roy knew he needed to get television exposure if he was going to have a chance of developing the type of promotion he wanted. During the early 1950s, television and wrestling had helped each other grow tremendously, and all 4 major TV networks at the time had wrestling shows running in prime time. In most parts of the United States, viewers were able to watch wrestling 5 nights a week from all over the country. That was how wrestling promoters and TV networks discovered that too much of one thing was not that good. People did not have to buy tickets to watch wrestling live, and after a while they were not watching it for free either. Business went down in many cities. By the late 1950s, when Roy Shire arrived in California, Joe Malsowitz had a TV show running in San Francisco, but there was not a lot of competition on TV anymore. Stars that frequented the territory around this time included Enrique Torres, Johnny Barend, Gene Kiniski, Lord James Blears, Bobby Bruns, Steve Stan Lee, Ray Thunder Stern, Gorgeous George, and Bob Orton. Roy had a good wrestling show on tape to offer and started making the rounds of TV stations in San Francisco, hoping to find a station that would broadcast his tapes for free. KTVU Channel 2 was a very new independent television station located in Oakland across the San Francisco Bay, but it had a very strong signal and could be viewed throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. Roy was borrowing tapes from a promotion in the Midwest and was using some of their stars in live shows he started running in Northern California cities. Roy was still wrestling himself then too, when he had to. As soon as Roy had several cities running regularly, he could support his own stable of wrestlers. Roy started producing his own weekly show at the Channel 2 studios in Oakland. All Star Wrestling started broadcasting live every Friday night at 9 p.m. from Channel 2's brand new studio in Oakland. At first, Roy was flying up an announcer from Los Angeles to host his show, but the expense bothered him. It wasn't long before Roy introduced a new announcer, Walt Harris, to Bay Area fans. Roy and the fans loved Harris, and he remained the host of All Star Wrestling throughout its run on Channel 2. In response to the threat posed by Shire's big-time wrestling promotion, Malsowitz, who had long resisted emergence of televised wrestling, fearing it would compete with live events, began running shows each Monday night on KTVU in 1961, as well as moving from the Civic Auditorium to the Kezar Pavilion as a cost-cutting measure. Despite this, Shire prevailed in the short territorial battle with his roster, built around the flamboyant aerial performer Ray Stevens, proving more popular than the slower-moving heavyweights who made up of Malsowitz's roster. Stevens captured the area's top single championship, the United States belt, in November of 1961 by defeating Cowboy Bob Ellis. Stevens quickly became the man Bay Area fans loved to hate, with his loud, cocky ways and his great microphone skills. Ray was known to whisper to the announcer that he had never seen such a bunch of ugly women as he saw in whatever city the interview was done for. The new hatred the fans had for Ray, as well as his exciting form of wrestling and bump taking, made for a very entertaining wrestling star. Malsowitz continued to hang on until 1961, when he folded NWA San Francisco later that year. He kept promoting shows up until early 1962, but little by little his crowds disappeared and he died on April 20th, 1962 of a heart attack. His last big show was at the Cow Palace, which drew $52,339, which was also a charity event. All Star Wrestling was a big success. It became one of Channel 2's most popular shows and was drawing great crowds to Roy's house shows. It was All Star Wrestling that made Roy Shire's bold move to promote a show at the Cow Palace possible. Roy announced he would present a big wrestling card at the Cow Palace in March 1961, a move that made most think he was crazy. Over the next 2 years, Roy Shire was selling more tickets and making more money than any other wrestling promotion in the world. The National Wrestling Alliance, however, remained angry with Roy for running in opposition to one of its members, and despite many attempts to join them, they had still yet to let Roy join the NWA. In 1963, Roy Shire was fined $500 by the California Athletic Commission for using abusive language and threatening a referee. Referee Pete Peterson testified he had disqualified Ray Stevens from the main event against Wilbur Snyder after he discovered that Shire was in Stevens' dressing room as an advisor rather than a promoter. He claimed Shire protested the ruling with bad language and threats. One of the attractions to bring in more fans was the annual Battle Royal held at the Cow Palace. The first Cow Palace Battle Royal was held on November 11, 1967, and the first man to win was the great Bearcat Wright. The following year in 1968, the winner was Big Bill Miller. In November of 1969, Ray Stevens won his first of 3 Battle Royal victories. Both 1970 and 1971, there was no Battle Royals at the Cow Palace. By the year of 1972, there was an 18-man Battle Royal. This was the event San Francisco fans looked forward to all year. The rules had evolved and each wrestler put up $500 for a total of $9,000, and Roy Shire put up the additional money. Roy Shire would tell the TV audience how hard it was to get wrestlers to come in and take this kind of chance at ending their career in such a match. They'd bring out tag team partners, whether it was Ray Stevens and Peter Maivia or Pat Patterson and Paul DeMarco, and they would talk about how they were friends up until the Battle Royal, but once in there, it was time to watch your back. The build-up became bigger and better each year for the annual event. Ray Stevens won the 1972 Battle Royal. It was also famous for having wrestlers from outside the territory enter the match. Man Mountain Mike, advertised at over 600 pounds, and Haystacks Calhoun, also over 600 pounds, were frequent entrants, as was Big Cat Ernie Ladd. In 1973, Battle Royal was won by the main villain in the area, the Great Mephisto. The High Chief Peter Maivia won the 1974 Battle Royal held on January 26. The January 1975 Battle Royal was won by one of the most popular wrestlers to ever wrestle in San Francisco, Pat Patterson. He was the main draw in the San Francisco territory, second to Ray Stevens. In 1976, the winner was Mr. Fuji, who was also a former U.S. champion. The 1977 Battle Royal was won by the king of the Battle Royals himself, Andre the Giant. Andre in those days didn't have a territory he called home, but was always in California for both the LA and San Francisco Battle Royals. Don Morocco won the 1978 Battle Royal. Morocco had successful runs in the region as both heel and face. Ron Starr won the 1979 Battle Royal and was one of the headliners in the area at the time. The 1980 Battle Royal was won by Ray Stevens, and on the same card faced NWA champion Harley Race. Although Ray Stevens was getting on in the years at this point, him and Harley Race still had a great match, which is still talked about today. The last San Francisco Battle Royal was held January 24, 1981, and was won by Pat Patterson. It seems only fitting that Stevens and Patterson won the last 2 Battle Royals, as they were the 2 biggest stars in the history of the promotion. Other stars that passed through the area around this time included Ricky Romero, The Destroyer, Red Lions, Cowboy Jack Lanza, Buddy Austin, Angelo Poffo, Red Bastion, and Wilbur Snyder. In August 1968, Big Time Wrestling finally became a member of the NWA. Shire even served as vice president of the organization for a period in the early 1970s. In 1970, the promotion attempted to expand to Anchorage, Alaska, where the Los Angeles-based promotion NWA Hollywood was involved and performed many successful shows during the late 1950s and 60s, but ticket sales were not high enough to support regular appearances, and the promotion did not return. Roy Shire suffered a great setback in 1970 in his television operations when Channel 2 told Roy they would not let him produce All-Star Wrestling in their studio anymore, and that they were dropping the show from their weekly lineup. This was devastating to Roy's plans to have his show cancelled. Why did KTVU Channel 2 cancel the most popular program on their schedule? There were a lot of rumors making their way around the arenas as people tried to make some sense of this critical development. One of the rumors going around was that Channel 2 employees did not like Roy spitting his snuff juice on the floors of their offices and studios. But there is no rumor, that's what happened. Roy, who lived on a cattle ranch, always had a bit of snuff in his mouth, and he always needed a place to spit the juice out. It was no problem for Roy. The floor worked just fine for him, no matter where he was. KTVU employees, however, did not like having to clean up after him. Management spoke to him about it on several occasions, and it came down to one last warning. If Roy spit on the floor anymore in the KTVU buildings again, All-Star Wrestling would be cancelled. The next Cow Palace show had a very small gate. Roy handed out leaflets to everyone asking them to call or write KTVU management and plead for the return of All-Star Wrestling. But pleas fell on spotless floors, and management was unmoved. Their time slot now belonged to Star Trek. In the 1970s, Shire secured a new deal with the KBHK, airing Big Time Wrestling, and featured Hank Renner as play-by-play announcer. He was later joined by Pepper Martin as color commentator. By late 1975, Roddy Piper was a top villain for Mike and Gene LaBelle's NWA Hollywood Wrestling. In 1977, he also started to work for Roy Shire and NWA San Francisco. in addition to remaining with the Los Angeles office where Piper developed his rowdy character. During this time, he made continuous insults directed at the area's Mexican community. He later promised to repent by playing the Mexican national anthem on his bagpipes, only to anger the fans further by playing La Cucaracha instead, which in turn caused a riot. In 1976, Roddy Piper wore a mask and was known as a Canadian and feuded with Pat Patterson over the United States title until he was unmasked by Hector Guerrero. Piper also won the NWA Pacific Northwest Heavyweight Championship with victories over both Lord Jonathan Boyd and Playboy Buddy Rose. During 1978, Roddy Piper would feud with Moondog Mayne, who would tragically die in a car accident during their feud. News of the death did not reach the promotion right away, therefore it was assumed that Mayne had simply failed to arrive on time. The announcer concocted a story that Mayne was backstage, but enraged and refusing to come out and wrestle. The taped program did not air until 5 days later, by which time many fans were aware of Mayne's death, which had happened almost a week earlier. By early 1979, Piper left the California promotions for even more fame in Don Owens' Portland-based Pacific Northwest territory. In the early 1980s, Piper ventured to the Mid-Atlantic territory, where he defeated Ric Flair for the U.S. belt. Other stars that came through the territory during the 1970s included Ed Wiskowski, Dean Ho, Black Gordman, Alex Smirnoff, Mondo Guerrero, Kurt and Carl Von Steiger, Texas Red, Jimmy Golden, Vicky Williams, the Fabulous Moolah, Chavo Guerrero, Bob Roop, and referee-turned-wrestler Ed Moretti, who would later be known as Moondog Moretti. Coming off a serious knee injury in 1977, Roop made his way to the territory and began a feud with Kevin Sullivan. Behind the scenes, Roop was planning to take over the promotion, but one of the boys he included in his plans ratted him off to Roy, and he fired him in a New York minute. According to Roop, Roy had a bad habit of stiffing guys by paying 2 weeks late. Then, since most of the boys had left the area once their bookings were completed, Roy never had to face them again. In 1979, Playboy Buddy Rose got on the mic in the Cow Palace and blasted Shire. Rose had just returned from a major disciplinary action by the California Athletic Commission. Though he had been cleared to wrestle, Shire sent 2 other wrestlers to the ring to fight for Rose's U.S. Championship belt. Roy threatened to have Buddy blacklisted in the NWA, and Buddy countered by telling the fans in attendance that night exactly what he thought of Roy, and his opinions why wrestlers were leaving and business was in a slump. Roy called the police to arrest Buddy, but they thought it was part of the show and said they didn't want to be part of it. This infuriated Shire so bad that he got in everyone's face and was escorted out of his own show by security. On a website during a Q&A session with a fan, Buddy Rose would write, "Here's the story of my shoot with Roy Shire. Roy was a good payoff man and he was a great promoter, but he did have his downsides. I was suspended by the state athletic department over something that was so foolish, it was finally dropped. But in the meantime, Roy thought that I wouldn't be able to get an injunction in time to defend my U.S. heavyweight title the following Saturday night at the Cow Palace. Well, it came to the night of the show, and Roy had put in a substitute in my place of the match, telling people that the winner of the bout would be the new United States heavyweight champion. I was in the dressing room ready to wrestle, and Roy asked me why I was there. I said to defend the U.S. title. He said, "No, you're not. I won't even let you near the ring." I explained to him that I was legal with the commission and I could wrestle. He said I can't be, because it was like swimming across the ocean and I'd never make it. I showed him my injunction and he still said no. I proceeded to tell him I was going to go to the ring and tell the people that I was in the building ready to defend the U.S. title. Roy said, "To hell you are." John Tolos was there listening along with Red Bastion, Ed Wiskowski, Ron Starr, and John Mantell, just to name a few. Roy sent the 2 wrestlers to the ring to determine the new champion. He announced just like he said he was going to. It was a 2 out of 3 falls match. Well, you can understand I was pretty upset over all this. After the first fall, I headed to the ring and Roy chased after me. I made it to the ring apron and I was walking around it, all the while Roy was running around on the floor trying to get me. Roy finally yelled at some of the San Francisco's finest to have me removed, and they said they were not going to be part of the show. Roy, who was fuming at this point, took a swing at one of the cops. They grabbed Roy and took his ass to the back of the building. I got on the microphone and told people the whole story, not to mention why Mr. Fuji, Don Morocco, Professor Tanaka, and others had packed up and left the Bay Area. I said it was because of promoter Roy Shire lying to the fans about personal circumstances. That was always the case. I heard the people screaming that they wanted their money back, and that, my friend, was the beginning of the end for Roy Shire. Ray Stevens saw me about a year and a half later and shook my hand and he said, "Kid, that was the greatest thing you have ever done." He was proud of me. Red Bastion supported me along with all the other wrestlers. Moral of the story, sometimes in life you have to take a stand, especially when you know you're right. In 1979, it was reported Roy Shire was under investigation by the Attorney General's office for violation of various codes and was charged with acting as if he were above the State Athletic Commission. Shire canceled his TV program on Channel 40. In 1980, Roy Shire suffered a heart attack and underwent bypass surgery and retreated to his 800-acre ranch. Eddie and Mike Graham from Florida would attempt to run shows in the area, but it had all dried up. With a gate less than $10,000, it was barely enough to break even. In 1981, Vern Gagne and his AWA ran its first show in Oakland, California, which featured Andre the Giant, Jerry Blackwell, Nick Bockwinkel, Tito Santana, AWA champions Adrian Adonis and Jesse Ventura, John Studd, Dino Bravo, Bobby Heenan, and two of the top stars of big-time wrestling, Pat Patterson and Ray Stevens. Later in 1981, Roy Shire was fined $900 by the State Athletic Commission for failure to make payments to the Boxers and Wrestlers Fund, which was set up to take care of medical bills. In 1983, Roy did an interview with a newspaper and explained how all the matches were pre-planned and was tired of fooling the public. He even went as far as to explain how he pulled punches, learning by practicing with a balloon. His rationalization was he wanted to get back at Gene LaBelle for lack of support, kill the wrestling business in California before Vern Gagne and Vince McMahon or any other promoter could do it first, and spare his longtime fans and customers the embarrassment of reading how he was fooling the public for all those years. On September 19, 1992, Roy Shire passed away at the age of 70 from a heart attack. Because tapes were so expensive back in the day, the television station just recorded over every show every week in order to save money. Therefore, not much footage is left from the promotion. Currently, shows in the Northern California area are being ran by West Coast Wrestling, AIWF West Coast, PCW Ultra, and Pro Wrestling Revolution, among others. That was the untold story of Big Time Wrestling San Francisco. Central States Wrestling was a professional wrestling promotion that operated from 1948 until it closed in 1989. Its main headquarters was based in Kansas, and it also ran shows throughout Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska. It was also known as Heart of America Sports Attractions, Midwest Wrestling Association, and finally, World Wrestling Alliance. The territory was one of the original territories of the National Wrestling Alliance, with two of the 6 founding fathers of the NWA, Paul Pinky George and Orville Brown, promoting it. And its latter years, it was purchased by Bob Geigel, who changed the name to World Wrestling Alliance, in an attempt to compete with the national expansion of Jim Crockett and Vince McMahon. The move did not pay off, and Geigel closed WWA in 1989. The tape library is currently owned by the WWE when it was obtained through their purchase of World Championship Wrestling, the previous owners of the library. This is the untold story of Central States Wrestling. It was 1912. The Boston Red Sox beat the New York Giants 4-3 to win the World Series. White Star liner RMS Titanic departs from Southampton, England, with more than 2,200 passengers and crew on her maiden voyage bound for New York, but strikes an iceberg in the northern Atlantic and sinks with the loss of more than 1,500 lives. Pioneer aviator Wilbur Wright of the Wright brothers dies of typhoid fever. Casimir Funk formulates a concept of vitamins, which he originally named Vital Almonds. And on June 24, 1912, a mid-card wrestler by the name of Curtis Kerr of Rochester, New York, began promoting shows in the area, seeing stars such as the wrestling physician Dr. B.F. Roller, Yusef Hussein, and a young Gotch. By the following year, Curtis Kerr had returned to his roots as a mid-card wrestler and had moved to Texas, and by 1920, wrestling had died down in the area and was considered a circus sideshow or an added attraction to a boxing event. That lasted until the late 1930s when Orville Brown made his way into the sport. Orville Brown grew up on a small farm in Sharon, Kansas, where he worked during the mornings before walking several miles to school in Kiowa, Kansas. He only attended 1 year of school due to financial hardships and left home at the age of 11. Brown was noticed by Ernest Brown, who was no relation but a former manager of amateur and professional wrestlers in the late 1920s, who was convinced that he might have a future as a wrestler and agreed to train him. By 1939, he partnered with former boxer Pinky George and had formed the Midwest Wrestling Association, which was the largest organization of wrestling promoters in the country. This group recognized John Pesek, who had the most solid claim to the title as heavyweight champion, and Orville Brown and Dick Shycat shared the rating as number one contender. Pesek was playing it very carefully, not beating top contenders. He was warned to become more active and agreed to more matches with top challengers. In January 1940, the governing board of the Midwest Wrestling Association gave Pesek a formal written order to meet at least one of the number one contenders by June 1st, 1940. Pesek failed to comply, and on June 5, 1940, the Midwest Wrestling Association membership meeting in Louisville, Kentucky, by unanimous vote, ousted John Pesek from the championship by default. The executive board directed that a match be held as soon as possible between Shycat and Brown to establish a new champion. The Brown-Shycat title match was held in Columbus, Ohio on June 28, 1940. Orville beat him in 2 straight falls. In the ringside ceremonies, Orville Brown was proclaimed the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world and was awarded the Diamond Belt. The championship was undisputed as far as the Midwest Wrestling Association was concerned, but there were other smaller groups which had their own champion. Orville Brown began a campaign to force other champions to meet him and other organizations to recognize his legitimate claim to the title. Orville was the catalyst which brought about the formation of the National Wrestling Alliance in 1948. Cards were held throughout the state, including Salina, Garden City, Great Bend, Emporia, Atchison, Ottawa, and Manhattan, and usually held in the National Armory, high school gyms, or Memorial Hall. By 1949, Orville Brown had held some 13 world titles and was recognized as the first NWA champion. His professional wrestling career ended on November 1, 1949, when disaster struck. Orville came over the top of a hill near Bethany, Missouri, to find a semi-truck trailer crosswise in the road. His car struck the trailer and lodged underneath it. Both him and his passenger were powerful men and had pushed back the seats as far as possible, which broke. This fortunately prevented them from being decapitated. His passenger suffered a broken arm and shoulder, plus numerous cuts and bruises. Orville's head struck the main frame of the trailer. He had severe brain damage, plus cuts and bruises. His car, a nearly new Cadillac, was sold for salvage for $218. He was scheduled to participate in a unification match against Lou Thez on November 25, 1949. Thez was awarded the title as Brown was unable to compete. In a 1952 article published by the Catholic Advance, wrestling was at an all-time low. The article, written by Bill Warner, described pro wrestling becoming increasingly revolting with effeminately dressed men and masculine women. Some of the stars that came through the territory around this time were Wee Willie Davis, Richard Brown, Wild Red Berry, Dr. Lee Grable, Gorgeous George, and Tommy O'Toole. The Central States title in the early 1950s was originally called the NWA Heart of America Heavyweight title. Orville Brown completely retired in 1957 and did not retain an interest in wrestling after that. The world was changing and wrestling changed more than anything. It really hurt him to see what television and unscrupulous people had done in order to milk more money from the sport he enjoyed since the time of the caveman. He would not even watch wrestling on television. His beloved sport had been destroyed.
Hello. Wrestling
Bill Kirsten attended his first wrestling event with his dad in Memorial Hall in Kansas City in 1941 and began ushering fans at wrestling matches in 1947. He began working as a public address announcer in 1956. At the same time, he began his career television as a play-by-play announcer, and the next year he initiated his famed Hello Wrestling Fans salutation. His announcing career spanned over 3 decades. Bill also served as mayor of Liberty, Missouri from 1995 to 1997 and passed away on October 20th, 2017. Other announcers in the territory were Kevin Wall and Rick Stewart. In 1963, wrestler/promoter and current U.S. champion Bob Geigel took over and partnered with Pat O'Connor, as well as promoters George Simpson and Gus Karras to form Heart of America Sports Attractions Incorporated. Throughout the 1960s, the territory would see stars such as Luther Lindsay, Sonny Myers, Jessica Rogers, Kathy Starr, George Gump, and Bulldog Henning. The television program of the Central States area was All Star Wrestling, and it was filmed during their weekly Thursday night card in Memorial Hall in Kansas City. The matches were usually shown on Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. on KSHB TV Channel 41. Wrestlers that appeared in the Central States area in the 1970s included Bob Geigel, who was the head booker and promoter of the late 1970s, Harley Race, Bulldog Bob Brown, Black Angus Campbell, Roger Nature Boy Kirby, Mike George, Jesse Ventura, Danny Littlebear, The Viking, Big O Bob Orton, Steve Bolas, Pat O'Connor, Frankie Diamond, Omar Atlas, Bobby Whitlock, Sonny Myers, and Ronnie Etchison. The promotion continued to be a cornerstone of the NWA, with Geigel sitting on the board of directors and even served as chairman of the NWA from 1978 until 1987. The period is considered to be the last glory years of the NWA. In June of 1967, a Kansas City man named John Nielsen filed a lawsuit claiming $300,000 in damages against Heart of America Sports as well as WWWF-TV, alleging injuries and invasion of privacy. Nielsen claimed employees of the station and the wrestling promotion, by hypnotic suggestion, compelled him to take part in a sleeping hold demonstration between matches. He claimed he was made unconscious by the hold and filmed without his permission. He claimed $100,000 in actual damages and $200,000 in punitive damages. That wasn't the only court battle. Later that year in October, Heart of America Sports Attractions was once again in court, when David and Marjorie Anthill sued the company, as well as Handsome Jack Donovan for $27,500. The plaintiffs alleged they were at the match, and Donovan left the ring and attacked them, resulting in injuries. In March 1968, one of the owners, George Simpson, passed away at the age of 72, and Bob Geigel purchased his interest in the company. After wrestling bears in front of spectators for most of the 1950s, in 1959, William J. Cobb, aka Happy Humphrey, began his pro wrestling career, regularly facing Haystacks Calhoun and even selling out Madison Square Gardens, as well as being one of the first super heavyweights to compete in a handicap match. Usually being billed at 750 pounds, on a few occasions he reached the 800-pound mark, and at least one occasion tipped the scale at over 900 pounds. He is to this day the heaviest man to ever wrestle professionally. Humphrey's promoters had a 1951 Pontiac, heavily modified to carry the wrestler around. Seats were removed and extra shocks were installed to support Humphrey's enormous weight, and also as a gimmick. In addition, he was usually weighed before matches on a meat scale at rendering facilities. In 1960, Humphrey met future multiple NWA World Champion Harley Race, who was only 17 at the time. Race, who was just beginning his own career, was hired as Humphrey's driver, and he also wrestled Humphrey on multiple occasions. Race earned $5 a day plus room and board for driving Humphrey, and $25 for each match he wrestled with the Giant. According to Race, Humphrey was so large that normal showers could not accommodate him. As a result, Humphrey was obliged to lie naked on the ground while Race would apply liquid soap to his body, scrub him with a mop, and rinse him off with a garden hose. Race also stated that Humphrey, who taught him how to take bumps properly, was a very kind person and one of the few wrestlers of his era who took the time to sign an autograph for everyone and to socialize with fans. Humphrey had difficulty fitting in with regular society due to his great size. People stared at him on the street, and he was often refused service at restaurants. In one incident in Alabama, he became stuck in a telephone booth and 8 police officers were required to extract him. In another incident in New Orleans, Humphrey attended a movie and became stuck in the theater seat. Welders had to cut the seats around him in order to get him out. In 1962, Humphrey was forced into early retirement due to a heart condition. After retiring, his weight again ballooned to over 900 pounds. At this weight, he would retire after about 10 steps and have to sit down in 2 chairs. Humphrey attempted to control his eating habits, which sometimes included eating up to 15 whole chickens in one sitting. But after consulting with doctors, he decided to volunteer for obesity research and checked himself into the Medical College of Georgia's Clinical Investigation Unit in Augusta. Upon entering the clinic, he weighed 802 pounds. For 2 years, Humphrey followed a strict doctor-controlled diet. He was not allowed to exercise in order to avoid fluid loss via sweat. He was also confined to the air-conditioned clinic itself. In the spring of 1965, Humphrey left the clinic where he had lived the 2 previous years. He weighed a comparatively healthy 232 pounds, a total loss of 570 pounds since he was admitted. Humphrey won a place in the Guinness Book of World Records as champion slimmer for his weight loss. After leaving the clinic, Humphrey got a job at an Augusta, Georgia shoe repair shop. He stated that he missed the sport and mixing it up with other wrestlers, but was looking forward to a new life as a normal-sized individual. In 1973, he competed in a battle royal in Georgia for promoter Ann Gunkel and was back to 625 pounds. In 1975, Humphrey appeared in the film The Moonrunners as Tiny the Syndicate Man, the TV show The Dukes of Hazzard was based on. In later years, Humphrey could never control his own weight and died of a heart attack on March 14, 1989 at 62 years old. At the time of his death, he weighed over 600 pounds. Originally recruited by Gus Karras to do odd jobs for the promotion, as well as chauffeuring around the 800-pound Happy Humphrey, Harley Race soon was training under some of the veterans like Buddy Austin and Stanislaus and Waldeck Zabisco, who operated a farm in his native Missouri. At the age of 18, already 6'1" and 225 pounds, he moved to Nashville and began wrestling under the ring name of Jack Long, forming a tag team with storyline brother John Long. The duo quickly captured the Southern Tag Team Championship. Race was seen as a rising star in the business until a car accident put him out of action, with his leg nearly amputated. His pregnant wife, Vivian Louise Jones, died instantly. They had been married just over a month. Karras had heard about his employee's condition, went rushing to the hospital, and blocked the planned amputation, declaring it over my dead body. In doing so, he saved Race's leg. Although he recovered, doctors told Race that he might never walk again, and his wrestling career was definitely over. Undaunted, Race endured grueling physical therapy for several months and made a full recovery. He returned to the ring in 1964, wrestling for Terry Funk's Amarillo, Texas territory. This time he wrestled as Harley Race, after his father told him that he should not work to make anyone else's name famous. Race never again used a different ring name. In Amarillo, Race met fellow up-and-coming wrestler Larry Hennig. The two formed a tag team and moved to the American Wrestling Association. In 1973, he returned to Kansas City and did very well teaming with Roger Nature Boy Kirby. As well as a singles wrestler, he held the NWA Missouri Heavyweight Championship, as well as the Mid-Atlantic version of the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship. He also started what would be many tours to Japan in All Pro Wrestling, where he faced Giant Baba. He worked with All Japan from 1973 to 1989. In 1973, Race also took the nickname Mad Dog and faced NWA World Heavyweight Champion Dory Funk Jr. in Kansas City. Race emerged from the battle as the new champion in what was perceived by fans as a stunning upset. Behind the scenes, Funk had pulled out of losing the title to Jack Briscoe, citing injuries in a truck incident. In truth, Amarillo promoter Dory Funk did not want his son losing to a fellow babyface. A title defense from his first reign held in Calgary against Klondike Bill aired as the main event on an episode of the promotion's Stampede Wrestling program. Most of his televised matches of this era were squash matches held in television studios. Though Race held the title for only a few months, losing it to Briscoe in Houston, Texas in July, he became a worldwide superstar. Back in the day, television captured it all. Some regular fans appeared so often on TV, they too became local celebrities. Undoubtedly, the most recognizable were Murdy and Gertie Height, known as the Twins. The twins occupied ringside seats at Memorial Hall for as long as anyone can remember, dressed exactly alike. When the mysterious force of wrestling moved inside them, they leaped to their feet, raced screaming to the edge of the ring to pound on the canvas and curse like drunken sailors. They never spent a night apart until February of 1977, when Gertie passed away and Murdy would follow in 1983. Race became involved in the ownership side of wrestling, buying a portion of the Kansas City and later St. Louis territories. St. Louis was a stronghold of the NWA, and around the time in 1984, WWF owner Vince McMahon began his invasion of the NWA territories, including St. Louis, in his ambition to build a truly national wrestling promotion. Race was enraged, famously confronting Hulk Hogan and the Funk Brothers at a WWF event in Kansas City. The same night Central States Wrestling ran its Thursday night shows at Memorial Hall, the WWF ran its show at the St. Louis Arena. That went against all the unwritten rules in the wrestling business. But the then 39-year-old Vince McMahon was usually dealing with promoters much older who did not stand a chance against a shrewd businessman, as well as changing times. In 1984, according to Bob Geigel, just weeks prior to this, Vince McMahon attempted to purchase Central States Wrestling, but failed to come up with the cash when it was time to make the deal. A year earlier, the WWF was still a member of the NWA, with Vince Sr. running the show. The same article also stated this was a Texas death match between promoters. Race lost over $500,000 as the owner of the Kansas City territory, and despite his championship years at the end and wishing to retire from active competition, was forced to rely on continuing to wrestle to make a living. He continued to travel to the United States and abroad and signed with McMahon's WWF in 1986. Crazy Luke Graham had a long and distinguished career in pro wrestling before he went to the Central States area. He was one half of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation World Tag Team Champions, along with Tarzan Tyler. They were the first team managed by Captain Lou Albano to win the WWWF World titles. In 1975, 24-year-old 6'2" Surf Ventura made his pro wrestling debut in Central States Wrestling. He would stay in the area throughout 1975 before making his way to the Pacific Northwest. In July of 1976, Heart of America Sports entered into a contract with Mayor William J. Bennett to rent the auditorium for $125 a night and $25 extra for the balcony. Some of the most popular rivalries in the territory were Geigel and Brown versus Stomper and Cowboy Bob Ellis, Danny Little Bear versus Harley Race, Roger Kirby versus Rufus R. Jones, Mike George versus Don Fargo, D.I. Bob Slaughter versus Ted DiBiase, Viking versus Stomper, and Ric Flair versus Bruiser Brody. Colonel Buck Robley was a mainstay in the Central States area in the early 1980s. He was a manager and a wrestler. Surf Ventura was part of Robley's army for the short time he was there. In 1981, Central States held a tag team tournament to crown new champions. Terry Gordy and Michael Hayes defeated Rufus R. Jones and Terry Funk. Ted DiBiase and Tommy Rich defeated Gene Lewis and Steve Lawler. Buzz Tyler and J.J. Dillon defeated Bob Brown and Buck Robley. And Terry Gibbs and Bob Sweeten defeated Baron Von Raschke and Bobby Jaggers. In the second round, Terry Gordy and Michael Hayes defeated Ted DiBiase and Tommy Rich. And Terry Gibbs and Bob Sweeten defeated Buzz Tyler and J.J. Dillon. In the final round, Gibbs and Sweeten defeated Gordy and Hayes and became the new tag team champions. Hercules Ray Hernandez had wrestled just over a year when he entered the Central States area in 1982. He had wrestled in Florida and Texas before he came to the region. His list of opponents in just February 1982 alone included Jerry Valiant, Billy Howard, Larry Dwyer, Gene Lewis, Jerry Brown, and Dewey Robertson. Hernandez and Robertson also wrestled together as a tag team in February of 1982 as well. In May of 1982, Hercules Hernandez won the Central States TV title from Mark Romero. He successfully defended the title against Rufus R. Jones, Mike George, Buzz Avalanche Tyler, and Manny Fernandez, among others. Mark Romero regained the belt in December of 1982. The tag team of Hercules Hernandez and Dewey Robertson won the Central States Tag Team titles from Mike George and Mark Romero in the summer of 1982. Mike George and Mark Romero regained the belts in August of 1982. Hercules and Robertson regained the belts in September of 1982. They lost them again for a second time to the team of Bob Brown and Buzz Tyler in November of that year. In early 1983, Hercules Hernandez left the territory and wrestled as one of the Assassins in the Mid-Atlantic area. In June of 1983, in St. Louis, Missouri, Harley Race defeated Ric Flair for the NWA World title. Harley Race was a Missouri state champion when he won the NWA World title, so Race gave up the Missouri title. In July of 1983, in Kansas City, Harley Race defeated Ric Flair in a rematch. The next night in St. Louis was a tournament for the vacant Missouri state title, and Ric Flair won the belt by defeating Bulldog Bob Brown in the first round, Master G George Wells in the second round, and David Von Erich in the finals. In August of 1983 in St. Louis, Race again defeated Ric Flair, and in September of that same year in St. Louis, David Von Erich defeated Ric Flair for the Missouri state title, and David Von Erich defeated Flair again in a rematch in November. Sometime in 1983, while Harley Race was still NWA World Champion, Ric Flair wrestled Mr. Wrestling 2, in which the winner would receive a title shot against Harley Race the next time the world title was defended in Kansas City. What could possibly go wrong? In April of 1984, Marty Jannetty wrestled a mixed tag team match with his partner being Cowboy Lang. Jannetty and Lang faced a team of Roger Nature Boy Kirby and Little Tokyo. Jannetty and Lang won the match, and commentator Kevin Wall stated that was Marty Jannetty's first appearance on All-Star Wrestling. Marty Jannetty and Tommy Rogers became a tag team known as the Uptown Boys, and they feuded with the Grapplers. It is also noted that this Tommy Rogers is not the same Tommy Rogers that was one half of the Fantastics with Bobby Fulton. In 1985, Scott Hall, using the name Coyote, and Dan Spivey, using the name Eagle, formed a tag team called the American Starship. In August of 1985, when Ric Flair defended the NWA World title in Kansas City against Harley Race, with Bulldog Bob Brown as special referee, Brown and Race had been a tag team on and off for years. Bob Brown turned on Harley Race and cost Race a victory over Flair. Art Cruz started wrestling in 1981 as a face, but in 1986 he turned heel and was managed by Slick. Cruz teamed with Diamond Timothy Flowers as the Dream Team. Shawn Michaels came into the area starting out as a singles wrestler, but him and Marty Jannetty started teaming together and began calling themselves the Midnight Rockers. Marty and Shawn won the Central States Tag Team titles once in May of 1996 in Kansas City by defeating Brad and Bart Batten. The Batten twins regained the belts later that month in Kansas City. Marty Jannetty received the call from AWA, and Marty and Shawn left. By August of 1986, WWF returned, along with Harley Race, who faced B. Brian Blair in a preliminary match. Throughout the years, Race continued running World League Wrestling and his wrestling camp in Eldon, Missouri. Over the years, he needed surgery to his neck, hip replacements, knee replacements, and had 5 vertebrae in his back fused together through the years of taking hard bumps. In May 2017, he broke both legs in a fall at his home, one in several places. He needed 4 blood transfusions during surgery. Race will continue to promote World League Wrestling until his death while still in rehab. On August 1st, 2019, it was revealed by longtime friend Dustin Rhodes that Race had died from lung cancer at the age of 76.
Me, I know the decent boys over at the New Deal, and the prices can't be beat. How do I know? Because I traveled all over the world wrestling and shopping. Hey! If you don't get the best deal, call me.
Special sale on all Whirlpool. The decent boys at the New Deal refuse.
That was the untold story of Central States Wrestling.
Well, it's a legend of Bob Orton. Won the world title back in 1951.
Southeastern Championship Wrestling was a promotion that ran from 1974 to 1989. It originally began in Knoxville, Tennessee, owned by brothers Ron and Robert Fuller, and eventually extended all the way down to the Florida coast when they purchased Gulf Coast Championship Wrestling, along with partners Bullet Bob Armstrong, Jimmy Golden, and Roy Lee Welsh. Southeastern Championship Wrestling sustained itself through a mixture of homegrown talent, veterans who wanted easier road trips, and young up-and-comers. Many wrestlers who worked the territory considered it a vacation, but in the late 1970s, the wrestling wars between rival promotions led to a handful of wrestlers threatening to expose the business on an unreleased video, all stating that they had never had a real wrestling match and everything was pre-planned. This was somewhat of an insurance policy known as Plan B. Ron Fuller continued to run the promotion from 1985 until 1988 and changed the name to Continental Championship Wrestling before selling it to David Woods, and the name was again changed to the Continental Wrestling Federation, in a further attempt to compete with Vince McMahon and appear to resemble a nationwide promotion, even to the point of getting an odd national TV deal with the Financial News Network. Their last TV episode aired on November 25th, 1989. Their promotion closed after their final show on December 6, 1989. Many refer to this as a lost promotion, as so little is known about it even today. This is the untold story of Southeastern Championship Wrestling. It was 1974. As the world population reaches 4 billion people, Stephen King publishes his first novel, Carrie. The Philadelphia Flyers beat the Boston Bruins to win the Stanley Cup. President Gerald Ford pardons former President Richard Nixon following the release of the Smoking Gun tape. And Ron Fuller purchased Southeastern Championship Wrestling based out of Knoxville, Tennessee, from John Kazana, who was promoting shows in the area since the 1930s, where he focused mainly on the East Tennessee area and Alabama. In the early 1970s, Alabama was broken down into 3 separate regions, with different promoters and workers for each particular promotion. North Alabama consisted of Birmingham, Huntsville, Florence, and Gadsden, and was promoted by Nick Gulas, with most wrestlers coming from Memphis. The second area, located in and around Montgomery, was handled by Billy Golden, father of Jimmy Golden. The third section was Dothan and Mobile. Lee Fields controlled the area from southeast Alabama to southwest Alabama and northwest Florida from Panama City to Pensacola. The name of his territory was Gulf Coast Championship Wrestling, where he promoted most of the region. Some of the stars in the area included Bob Armstrong, Mongolian Stomper, Gorgeous George Jr., Jerry Blackwell, Bob Orton Jr., Bob Roop, Ron Garvin, David Schultz, Eddie Mansfield, and Rip Tyler were just a few of the names. In the beginning, the separate divisions of Southeastern Championship Wrestling were considered and treated as separates. They had their own belts, champions, and feuds, though they would often exchange talent. Ed Wolf was a full-time police officer who had a part-time wrestling career that was shortened before it could take off. During a match, he was thrown out of the ring and collided with a wooden folding chair that cut his muscles and blood vessels. He was hospitalized, where he contracted gangrene and had to have his leg amputated at the hip. On July 28, 1975, a benefit for Ed Wolf was held by Ron Wright, who was his tag team partner in the match which ended his career. The card featured several matches including Ron Fuller and Devoy Brunson, Cowboy Parker and Cowboy Dillinger faced Don and Ron Wright, and a 30-man battle royal. The gate was just under $3,800, which went toward Ed Wolf's medical bills at the time, which exceeded $8,000. In 1976, the Universal Wrestling Association, headed by Lou Thez, Buddy Lee, and Danny Davis, attempted to run shows in Nick Gulas' Nashville area of his territory. Traditionally, territories and boundaries were set in stone, and to invade another promoter's territory was considered a cardinal sin in the business. With stars such as Eric the Red, Wild Bill Curry, Saul Weingroff, Dr. Ken Ramey, and the interns, among others, Lou Thez publicly stated, "There will be no war, but there may be some type of skirmish because we're going to do some things that Nick Gulas won't like." He also claimed that his promotion was emphasizing wrestling and de-emphasizing gimmicks, which Nick Gulas relied highly on. Nick Gulas was convinced the new promotion was trying to put him out of business, using tactics such as coming to his shows and putting 2-for-1 handbills on the cars in the parking lot. In March of that year, Lou Thez and his Universal Wrestling Association held its highly financed, slickly produced premiere card at the Municipal Auditorium. Terry Gordy was both Terry Meeker and Mr. Wrestling in the promotion. Gordy grew up near Chattanooga and was known in the area to fans as a teenager who had just turned 15 at the time. So Thez put him under a hood as Mr. Wrestling. In the rest of the territory, he wrestled under the name Terry Meeker. Although Thez had high hopes for the UWA, they drew a fair crowd. Not near as many fans as Nick Goulas was drawing. He ran shows in Chattanooga on WRCB TV3 and at the Municipal Auditorium until the late summer of 1976. Thez was also able to persuade Don Green and Steve Kovacs, both longtime Goulas mainstays, to work for him. The group initially made Pez Whatley their champion. Their promotional war was over by the end of the summer. Goulas and Thez would work together in the future and also see things differently. In 1977, Gulf Coast Wrestling finally closed its doors and there was no local TV nor house shows happening at the Farm Center. However, things were about to change. Fuller expanded the promotion to Alabama and the Florida Panhandle, while the TV was still being done in Knoxville, with tape delay in Dothan on Saturday afternoon from the Friday night Farm Center shows. Bob Armstrong was the first Southeastern Southern Division heavyweight champion, winning a tournament final over David Schultz. Mr. Thatcher and Gordon Soley were brought in as hosts for the program. Southeastern now had two completely different TV shows, one for the Tennessee area, one for the Dothan, Mobile, Pensacola area, each with its own set of champions, belts, and feuds. But workers would bounce back and forth between the two separate divisions. Once the Dothan TV tapings began, no mention was made again of the Knoxville end of the territory. Gordon Soley did TV for a few weeks before he left the area. When he did, Charlie Platt, who had began doing ring announcing for Gulf Coast, took his place. Platt would become the voice for Southeastern as Thatcher left the area and Dick Steinborn became Charlie's co-announcer. As already mentioned, the first Southeastern Southern Division champion was Bob Armstrong. Other holders of that title between 1977 and 1980 included David Schultz, Don Carson, Toro Tanaka, Ron Fuller, the Mongolian Stopper, Ron Bass, Jimmy Golden, Austin Idol, Terry Hulk Boulder, Ox Baker, Gray Peterson, the Masked Gladiator, and Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods. The first tag holders of the Southern Division was a team of the Masked Assassins. Other teams to garner the belts from 1977 to 1980 included Ricky and Robert Gibson, Ricky Fields and Terry Latham, Rip Tyler and Eddie Sullivan, Ron and Robert Fuller, Don Carson and the Assassin, Robert Fuller and Bob Armstrong, the Samoans, Bob Armstrong and Charlie Cook, Ron Bass and Randy Rose, and Robert Fuller and Terry Gibbs. A Southeastern TV champion was also crowned. However, for some reason, the title never stuck around. The most successful managers in the area at the time were Billy Spears and Don Carson. However, both Gorgeous George Jr. and Rip Tyler worked there as well. NWA World Champion Harley Race made frequent title defenses as well, with Andre the Giant and Dusty Rhodes also coming in for appearances. In June 1979, several members of the talent roster and behind-the-scenes personnel left Southeastern Championship Wrestling out of frustration involving backstage politics with Ron's brother, Robert Fuller, who was considered lazy in terms of booking the territory and spent many nights partying and felt his spot in Southeastern was owed to him since he was a member of the Welsh Fuller family. It was also alleged that Ron Fuller was stealing money from the talent, even though his reputation among many veteran stars had never suggested he was anything but fair and honest. The incident which finally triggered the split occurred when Bob Roop and Ron Wright allegedly caught the ticket sellers stealing money from the gate at a house show. After confronting Fuller, Roop was convinced he had been acting under the promoter's orders. Led by Bob Roop, Ronnie Garvin, Bob Orton Jr., and Boris Malenko, started All-Star Championship Wrestling and fought a 6-month promotional war over the Knoxville territory. Also, many of these defectors later joined the Kentucky-based outlaw promotion International Championship Wrestling, owned and operated by Angelo Poffo. As well made a 20-minute video which was never released called Plan B. Not to be confused with the popular morning after birth control pill, in which Roop, Garvin, Orton, Malenko, as well as Ron Wright spoke about their amateur backgrounds. Garvin also talked about growing up on the streets in Canada, fighting with bats and chains. They all ended their testimony with the same thing: I've yet to have a real wrestling match. In later years, all of the wrestlers who appeared on the video Roop Garvin were interviewed on the Hannibal TV, and although Garvin laughed it off, Bob Roop appeared to try and stay in gimmick and gave somewhat evasive answers when questioned if any more videos existed. The video was intended to be submitted to the TV station to completely kill the territory if they didn't get their way. In response, Ron Fuller filed a lawsuit as well as a temporary restraining order against Roop, Garvin, Orton, and Malenko, as well as All-Star Championship Wrestling, for attempting to run him out of business, claiming the defendants behaved in a disorderly and obnoxious manner and attempt to farce away customers. Fuller also claimed they made defamatory statements against him and was asking for $2.5 million in damages. Garvin was also involved in a storyline feud with Fuller over the NWA Southeastern Heavyweight Championship prior to the split. A week before his departure, Garvin won both the title and a boat owned by Fuller. He was supposed to lose the belt the following week. However, Garvin and his partners planned to run their first show instead. Garvin brought the title with him upon forming All-Star Championship Wrestling and continued making title defenses on All-Star and ICW shows. Southeastern Championship Wrestling did not acknowledge this and quietly purchased a new belt. In addition to winning the title, Garvin also won a boat owned by Fuller. This was part of a scripted storyline rather than a legitimate prize, but Garvin kept the boat. However, Fuller lost the case rather than expose the business by admitting the match was predetermined. The guys finally had their way in. The Fullers left Knoxville and sold the promotion to Jim Crockett Promotions and Georgia Championship Wrestling. Fuller then made Birmingham his main end of the territory, with the Dothan end continuing to flourish, giving early exposure to future stars such as the Fabulous Freebirds, rising stars in the area like Austin Idol, and appearances by Ric Flair, who would defend the NWA World Heavyweight title in the area each year. In 1979, Terry the Hulk Boulder, aka Hulk Hogan, defeated Ox Baker on July 6 to win the Southeastern Heavyweight title. The Southeastern Heavyweight Championship Southern Division title was originally the primary singles championship for Gulf Coast Championship Wrestling and was originally named the NWA Gulf Coast Heavyweight Championship. As the name indicates, the title was recognized by the National Wrestling Alliance as a local title promoted in the Tennessee, Alabama, Florida, and Mississippi region from 1957 until 1977. In 1980, the title was abandoned and the Northern Division of the NWA Southeastern Heavyweight Championship became the main title of Southeastern Championship Wrestling. On December 1st, 1979, Hulk won the NWA Southeastern Heavyweight Championship Northern Division, recognized in Alabama and Tennessee, when he defeated Bob Roop in Knoxville. Hulk would drop the title in January 1980 to Bob Armstrong. He would briefly wrestle in Georgia Championship Wrestling from September through December 1979 as Sterling Golden. Later that year, former NWA World Heavyweight Champion Terry Funk introduced Hulk to the owner of the WWF, Vincent J. McMahon, who was impressed with his charisma and physical stature. McMahon, who wanted him to use an Irish name, gave Hulk the last name Hogan and also wanted him to dye his hair red. Hogan claims his hair was already beginning to fall out by that time and he refused to dye it. In Hulk Hogan's book, Hollywood Hulk Hogan, released in 2001, he described his first trip to New York and getting stopped in New Jersey, traveling with Afa and Sika, the Wild Samoans, which almost ended his career before it even started. He would write, "I had a Florida license. Of course, my car had Tennessee tags, but because I had bought it when I was working for Jerry Lawler in Memphis. So the cop, even getting more suspicious, asked me for my registration. I said, 'Yes, sir,' and ran around to the other side of the car to get my registration, which was in the glove box. But when I opened the glove box, it had a gun in it, and the cop freaked out. He pulled out his weapon and yelled, 'Get on the ground!' Me and the two Samoans had to get face down in the snow. I was wearing a t-shirt and no jacket, and it was freezing cold out. My hands were handcuffed behind me and had to lie in the snow for what seemed like forever. The funny thing is I had never fired a gun in my life. I had never owned one either. But when the wrestlers in Florida heard that I was going to New York, they told me I had to buy a gun to protect myself. It's not like Florida here,' they said. 'In New York, the fans are crazy. If you're going to be a bad guy, they might try and kill you.' So I went out and bought a little .22 caliber pea shooter and took it with me to New York, but hadn't even taken it out of the box. Just tucked it into my glove compartment and forgot about it. What I didn't know that it was an automatic 1-year sentence in New York or New Jersey if you were caught with an unregistered firearm. None of the Florida wrestlers ever mentioned that. I turned to Afa and Sika and said, 'Help me out here, guys. Tell these state troopers I had just bought the gun and didn't know a thing about the law they have here.' But in those days, we were very protective of the wrestling business, and Samoans weren't allowed to speak English. They were supposed to be headhunters, savages who pulled chickens apart with their bare hands and ate raw fish, not civilized people who could explain that they had made a mistake. So when the cops looked at Afa and Sika, they wouldn't talk. I begged them, but they wouldn't say a word. They were afraid they would get in trouble with Vince. So I went, damn. Anyway, the cops took us all to this makeshift police station on the side of the road and handcuffed me to a pipe outside. And again, I was standing in the snow and freezing my ass off. Finally, a couple hours later, they hauled me into the station and let me make one phone call, and I called Vince McMahon Sr. When I told him what happened, he said, Jesus Christ, and called Gorilla Monsoon, who was also a partner in the promotion and lived in that part of New Jersey. Meanwhile, the cops threw me in a cell and locked me up, and the two Samoans sat outside like a couple of little puppy dogs, waiting for Gorilla Monsoon to call in some favors. Finally, the cops got a call, and the next thing I knew, I was free. All I had to do was come there once a month for 6 months and meet with a probation officer. Apparently, Gorilla Monsoon had come through for me. In July of 1980, it was reported by the Tennessean that Nick Gulas had sold a percentage of his territory to Jerry Jarrett and Buddy Fuller. Although the size of the percentage was not mentioned, Gulas stated he was not ready to retire. In 1980, Fuller closed the Knoxville portion of Southeastern Championship Wrestling. By mid-1980, Southeastern had established itself as an energizing region extending along the South Alabama and Northern Florida outskirt. The Houston County Farm Center in Dothan, Bayfront Hall in Pensacola, and Marina Civic Center in Panama City were all home to weekly shows, and by fall of 1980, it was the ideal opportunity for development. In October 1980, Southeastern bought the promotional rights for North Alabama. With this buy, Southeastern was currently holding house shows in Birmingham, Gadsden, and Florence. This likewise brought Montgomery in central Alabama into the domain also. The majority of this region of Alabama had been controlled by Nick Gulas. A few grapplers working the region were at that point acquainted with the fans of North Alabama, for example, Bob Armstrong and Robert Fuller, so this made the development a smooth process. One of the principal things acting Southeastern Wrestling President Don Curtis did to help promote the opening of the entire state was to recreate the old Alabama heavyweight title. The title had a lineage going back to the 1950s, despite the fact that Southeastern had not utilized the title until this time. The tournament to grant the first champion was held in Birmingham in November 1980. Wrestlers from Southeastern, in addition to Mr. Wrestling 2 and Tony Atlas from Georgia, were entered into the competition with Barb Armstrong winning out. One of the principal men to fight Armstrong was Japanese Incredible Mr. Saito, who would eventually trade the belt with Bob several times. Other men to hold the belt during this period were Dennis Condrey, Jimmy Golden, Ray Candy, and Ken Lucas, who in consecutive weeks defeated Saito for the Alabama title and Ron Bass for the Southeastern title to be the only man to hold both belts simultaneously. In 1985, Fuller decided that it was time to reach beyond the southern Alabama and northern Florida area and return to the Knoxville end of the territory. With this expansion came a name change to Continental Championship Wrestling. This was an attempt on Ron Fuller's part to compete with Vince McMahon. After a failed negotiation with CBS, he settled on moving the television show out of the small television studio into the big arenas where they did house shows in order to give the promotion a national look and feel. While the name Southeastern restricted the promotion to a more regional feel, the name Continental gave fans the impression they toured all over the country, except Alaska and Hawaii. Fuller himself eventually became a favorite of the fans. His status in the Knoxville wrestling scene is still present today, and he is looked upon as many as a legend. In 1988, WCOV-TV owner David Woods bought the controlling interest in the promotion from Ron Fuller, and he renamed it Continental Wrestling Federation in a further attempt to compete with Vince McMahon and appear to resemble a nationwide promotion, even to the point of getting an odd national TV deal with the Financial News Network. Their last TV episode aired on November 25, 1989. The promotion closed soon after on December 6 of the same year. Due to the expensive nature of archiving at television stations before the home video boom in the 1980s, much of the footage from the Gulf Coast era and the Knoxville portion of Southeastern no longer exists, despite a few bits of rare footage turning up here and there, recorded by fans and talent. However, along with the majority of the Continental footage still exists, they are still owned by David Woods and Woods Communications. The promotion was eventually sold to Jim Crockett Promotions and became part of Georgia Championship Wrestling and WCW. That was the untold story of Southeastern Championship Wrestling. The International Wrestling Association was a professional wrestling promotion based in Cleveland, Ohio during the 1970s. It was founded by Eddie Einhorn and Pedro Martinez in 1975. The company descended from the original National Wrestling Federation. It was originally intended to be the first national wrestling promotion, but stayed primarily in the Mid-Atlantic region. The idea was simple: to offer a superior product in an era when an uneasy territorial balance of power existed between the National Wrestling Alliance, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and the American Wrestling Association. Einhorn offered his wrestlers more money and benefits than competing promotions, helping to lure big names such as Mil Mascaras, who was the company's heavyweight champion. Einhorn left the promotion later that year, and Johnny Powers took over as booker. The company scaled down and stayed in Virginia and North Carolina after losing an antitrust lawsuit against the rival Jim Crockett Promotions. The IWA closed its doors in 1978. In 1975, Ron Martinez introduced his friend Eddie Einhorn to his father, Pedro Martinez, and the duo established the International Wrestling Federation as a descendant company of Martinez's National Wrestling Federation. The IWA was originally intended to be the first national wrestling promotion. Einhorn offered professional wrestler George Scott a $250,000 a year salary and even a percentage of the business to be his partner, but Scott declined. To get prominent professional wrestlers such as Ernie Ladd and Mil Mascaras, the company used contracts that guaranteed money to the talent regardless of ticket sales. Einhorn also offered wrestlers deals that included transportation and lodging, in contrast to other promotions. Mil Mascaras was one of the promotion's initial champions. He mainly feuded with Ladd over the IWA Championship. Another one of the promotion's main feuds was between Mighty Igor and Bulldog Brower. During the storyline, Bulldog Brower attacked Mighty Igor on his birthday, knocking him into his birthday cake. The IWA's early house shows featuring Mascaras were competition for Vince McMahon's Worldwide Wrestling Federation. One show at the Roosevelt Stadium featured former WWWF World Heavyweight Champion Ivan Koloff against Mil Mascaras, drawing an attendance of 14,000. Later, the IWA shows were taped for television and aired on WOR Channel 9, while the WWWF aired shows on Spanish language WNJU Channel 47. The IWA used new innovations like freeze-frame shots and replays in slow motion to enhance the matches. Ron Martinez acted as booker, announcer, and producer for the television shows. Jack Reynolds and Tex McKenzie acted as play-by-play announcers, and Rick Gatone was the ring announcer.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next match will be
Einhorn's plans for the show was to be nationally syndicated. The main championship for the company was the IWA Championship. Mil Mascaras was a champion, winning it in Savannah, Georgia in 1975. He also defended the championship in Mexico. The unpredictable Bulldog Brower became the North American champion after a short reign by Ox Baker. The exact lineage of the title is unknown, but Johnny Powers claims to have held it 3 times. Even after the promotion closed in 1978, Powers defended the title overseas. He last defended it against Bulldog Brower in Nigeria in 1982, after which he retired from wrestling. The Mongols were the only title holder of the IWA Tag Team Championship. After Eddie Einhorn left the promotion, the Mongols also left in January 1976, taking the IWA Tag Team Championships with them to rival Jim Crockett Promotions, where they were billed as the International Tag Team Champions. The IWA North American Championship was the only title in the promotion to officially change hands. The first holder of the title was Ox Baker. He held the title for less than a year before losing it to Bulldog Brower. Female wrestlers also had a title in the promotion, the IWA North American Women's Championship. The sole holder of the title was Estelle Molina. Einhorn left the IWA in late 1975 due to business conflicts and a large financial loss. Subsequently, Johnny Powers became the booker for the IWA and scaled down the promotion. The company ran shows in Virginia and North Carolina for a couple of years. Ron Martinez stayed with the promotion for 3 years after Einhorn left. The promotion closed after an antitrust case had accused Jim Crockett Jr. of preventing the IWA from promoting shows in the area's large arenas, including the Winston-Salem Coliseum. The case was not successful, and the promotion closed its doors in 1978. The show was shown overseas in Nigeria and Singapore throughout 1978. Clips from the tape library were featured on ESPN's Cheap Seats, as well as ESPN's Classic Golden Age of Wrestling. That was the untold story of the International Wrestling Association. Continental Wrestling Association, later on the Championship Wrestling Association, was a wrestling promotion managed by Jerry Jarrett. The CWA was the name of the governing body for the Championship Wrestling Inc. promotion, which was usually referred to as Mid-Southern Wrestling or the Memphis Territory. This promotion was a chief NWA territory during the 1970s and early 1980s while operating out of Tennessee and Kentucky. The CWA was a member of the National Wrestling Alliance until 1986 and affiliated with the American Wrestling Association until 1989. In 1989, the CWA merged with the World Class Wrestling Association to form the United States Wrestling Association, thus ceasing to exist as a separate entity. The split. The professional wrestling territory, commonly referred to as the Memphis area, was originally part of the NWA Mid-America promotion that was founded in the 1940s. It operated in Memphis and Nashville, Tennessee, but also included stops in surrounding cities and states. The NWA Mid-American territory featured tag teams in nearly all of its main events, and sometimes featured only 1 or 2 singles matches to complement an evening of tag team matches. Such teams as the Von Brauners, the Interns, the Infernos, the Bounty Hunters, Tojo Yamamoto, and Jerry Jarrett, Don and Al Green, Bobby Hart and Lorenzo Parente, the Fabulous Kangaroos, Jerry Lee Lawler and Jim White, the Fabulous Fargos, and a host of other teams were regulars. During the mid-1970s, the focal point of the territory changed from tag team wrestling to singles action. In the mid-1970s, the territory split in 2 with separate promoters for each half. Jerry Jarrett was in charge of Memphis, Louisville, Lexington, and Evansville, while still part of NWA Mid-America, while Nick Goulas, who had been the primary booker, continued to promote the other half of the territory. Many of the wrestlers in the promotion were upset at Goulas for overbooking his son George in the profitable Memphis half of the territory. It was very hard to believe that George could regularly beat his larger, more experienced foes. George was given matches and wins over longtime veterans of the territory without paying his dues. After Jarrett had invested a large sum of money into what he thought was a 10% share of the promotion and learned that Goulas had tricked him into paying for an option to buy less, which by the time he had learned already expired. He decided to go his own way. Jarrett decided to break away by starting competing cards at the Cook Convention Center in March 1977. Goulas, who lived in Nashville, eventually made Music City his home base, running weekly cards at the fairgrounds and all over mid-Tennessee. Originally, Goulas was backed by many of the area's top draws. Jarrett, however, was backed by Jerry Lawler, who had just toppled Jackie Fargo as a headliner of the area, and a second with Lawler, he had Memphis. Goulas did attempt to run shows in Memphis for some time, but without the headliner, Lawler, he could not compete. This split between Goulas and Jarrett created the Continental Wrestling Association as a totally separate promotion run by Jarrett. In 1980, after only 3 years, the Goulas territory folded when Goulas retired and the CWA took over some of the more profitable locations, like Nashville, NWA affiliate. After the split from Nick Goulas, the CWA became a National Wrestling Alliance affiliate, which entitled the CWA to NWA World Heavyweight Championship defenses. The champion regularly toured through the territory, defending the title against the top contenders. The main title of the CWA was the Southern Heavyweight title, which was nominally sanctioned by the NWA into 1978, or the AWA beginning in 1978. The cornerstone of the CWA CWA was the weekly Monday night shows from the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis, where the cards regularly drew full houses. These shows were repeated in some form weekly at Louisville and Nashville on Saturday nights. Having 3 major shows in all 3 cities and an additional shows through other towns in Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, and northern Alabama provided significant profits into the early 1990s. These shows showcased a series of wrestlers as they made their way through the Memphis territory, including Hulk Hogan, Harley Race, Terry Funk, Jack Briscoe, and even Ric Flair. The biggest run of the promotion was the Jerry Lawler-Jimmy Hart feud, which lasted throughout the early 1980s. Jimmy Hart's first family included dozens of wrestlers who Hart had brought into the face of Lawler. Included in this list were the Iron Sheik, the Dream Machine, the Nightmares, Eddie Gilbert, Ken Patera, Jesse Ventura, Hulk Hogan, Bugsy McGraw, Kevin Sullivan, Bobby Eaton, Killer Tim Brooks, and Paul Ellering. The feud ended when Hart was signed by the World Wrestling Federation in 1985, and Lawler won a match against Eddie Gilbert in which the stipulation was Hart was to leave the territory. The Federation also aired live Saturday morning wrestling cards from the studios of WMC TV in Memphis, hosted by Lance Russell and Dave Brown. In the territorial era of wrestling, many local promotions had huge ratings with their wrestling shows, but none of them topped the ratings for the weekly CWA shows, which drew previously unheard of shares behind the strength of Lawler's local popularity. Throughout the late 1970s, the 1980s, and into the early 1990s, Jerry Lawler also engaged in feuds with Dutch Mantell, Robert Fuller, Mongolian Stopper, Bruiser Brody, Jimmy Valiant, Austin Idol, Rocky Johnson, Tommy Rich, Randy Savage, Rick Rude, and Bill Dundee, among others. Andy Kaufman comes to Memphis. In the early 1980s, Andy Kaufman routinely wrestled women during his shows, proclaiming himself as the intergender wrestling champion and offering women $1,000 if they could beat him. As part of his performance, Kaufman would imply that these matches were real, and thus also imply that wrestling was not real, which countered the saccharine belief that fans in the area that wrestling was real. Kaufman even started appearing on Mid-Southern Coliseum shows, wrestling women in the undercard matches. And after winning, Kaufman would berate the Memphis crowd and proclaim his own greatness in the sport. He even went so far as to claim that no woman could beat him, and if they did, he would marry that woman. Jerry Lawler, however, was a proud defender of wrestling and angry at Kaufman for mocking the sport that made him a star, so he decided to coach one of Kaufman's opponents. Kaufman still won despite Lawler's coaching and gloated until Lawler had enough and pushed Kaufman, sending the comedian on a tirade. The fans loved every second of it, watching the local star defend the sport against the arrogant actor from Hollywood. During the inevitable Lawler-Kaufman match, Lawler executed 2 pile drivers, a move that was banned in Memphis, after which Kaufman was carried out of the arena on a stretcher. The following day, several newspapers reported that Kaufman had in fact broken his neck. Several weeks later, Kaufman returned to the Mid-South Coliseum wearing a neck brace, vowing to get even with Lawler. The feud got national exposure in several newspapers after Kaufman's supposed injury, and it would get even more press after Kaufman discussed it on Saturday Night Live on July 27, 1982. Kaufman and Lawler were guests of David Letterman on Late Night with David Letterman. Kaufman still wore the neck collar after Kaufman unleashed a profanity-laced tirade on Lawler, ending with Kaufman throwing a cup of coffee on him. Lawler stood up and then slapped the comedian out of his chair and off the stage. Kaufman then continued cursing at Lawler as he stormed out of the studio. The antics of Lawler and Kaufman made NBC network executives uneasy, believing that the hatred between the two was real and that mayhem could break out at any time. Kaufman and Lawler kept claiming that their hatred and actions were real, but they were later revealed to have been a staged work, as the two were actually really good friends. The truth about it being a work was kept secret for more than 10 years after Kaufman's death, until the Emmy-nominated A Comedy Salute to Andy Kaufman aired on NBC in 1985. In 1987, in an interview with the Memphis Flyer, Lawler claimed he had improvised during the first match, and the Letterman incident, although officials at St. Francis Hospital stated that Kaufman's neck injuries were real. In his 2002 biography, It's Good to Be the King, Sometimes, Lawler detailed how they came up with the angle and kept it quiet. He also said that Kaufman's explosion on the Letterman was the comedian's own idea. AWA affiliation. At the end of 1982, Jerry Lawler had seemingly won the American Wrestling Association's world title from Nick Bockwinkel, but due to the match's controversial ending, the title was returned to Bockwinkel with a rematch scheduled on January 1983. On the night of the match, however, Jimmy Hart showed up in Bockwinkel's corner, face bandaged after being beaten up by Lawler in December. Near the end of the match, Jimmy Hart showed up revealing the bandaged man to be Andy Kaufman. In the confusion, Bockwinkel won the match. The Lawler-Kaufman feud ended in the early part of 1983 after Lawler threw a fireball at Kaufman, ending his run with the CWA. After Kaufman left, Lawler refocused his efforts on Jimmy Hart and his first family stable. Lawler challenging for the world title and almost winning it was a reoccurring theme throughout the mid-1980s, with neither the AWA nor the NWA being willing to actually put their main title on Lawler. The NWA world title was not defended very often in Memphis area, usually touring with companies that had more political clout in the alliance, which meant that the CWA actually featured the AWA World Championship more regularly than the group of which they were actually dues-paying members. In 1988, plans were set in motion to actually merge the AWA and the CWA into one federation in an attempt to counter the World Wrestling Federation's national expansion. The federation was renamed the Championship Wrestling Association. In late 1987, when Lawler became co-promoting with Jarrett, subsequently all singles titles in the CWA, AWA Southern, CWA, AWA International, and NWA Mid-America Heavyweight were merged in order to recognize one CWA Heavyweight Champion. On May 9, 1988, in Memphis, Lawler took on the reigning AWA World Champion Kurt Hennig and won the title. As the year went on, the AWA/CWA alliance was expanded to include the World Class Wrestling Association out of Texas, with the title unification match set for the AWA's first and only pay-per-view, AWA Super Clash 3. Lawler retained the AWA World Heavyweight Championship and won the WCWA World Heavyweight Championship in controversial fashion. The match was stopped due to excessive blood loss from Kerry Von Erich and was declared the unified world champion, cementing his claim by carrying the AWA and WCCWs with him. Due to controversies following the pay-per-view, the CWA and WCCW broke off their relationship with the AWA, and Lawler was stripped of the AWA World title. In retaliation, Lawler kept the physical AWA World Heavyweight Championship belt for not getting his payoff for Super Clash 3. After the cooperative attempt with AWA failed, Jerry Jarrett bought the WCCW from the Von Erichs and unified the two promotions as the United States Wrestling Association in 1989, thus ending the era of Continental Wrestling Association.
International Championship Wrestling was an independent professional wrestling promotion based in Lexington, Kentucky that operated from 1978 until 1984. It was run by WCW Hall of Famer Angelo Poffo, the father of Randy Savage and Lanny Poffo. Throughout its history, ICW was considered an outlaw promotion in which it was not a member of the National Wrestling Alliance and promoted shows in direct competition against NWA regional territories. It was 1978. Star Wars toys were flying off the shelves at every department and toy store. After nearly 30 years of production, Volkswagen stopped producing the Volkswagen Beetle. Cheech and Chong released their first feature-length film, Up in Smoke. The Hillside Strangler claimed his 10th and final victim. The Space Invaders arcade game was released by Taito Corporation, and Angelo Poffo established International Championship Wrestling as a rival to Ron Fuller's Southeastern Championship Wrestling and Nick Goulas's NWA Mid-American Territory, extending into Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association and Dick the Bruiser's World Wrestling Association territories by 1981. Later on, they'd come in direct competition with Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett's Continental Wrestling Association, as well as operating in their territories, and even managed to get several wrestlers to leave Southeastern and the CWA to join ICW. This, among other issues, would result in a series of lawsuits between Angelo Poffo and other NWA-affiliated organizations during the late 1970s and early 1980s. The main stars of ICW were Poffo's sons, Randy and Lanny, who frequently traded the promotion's heavyweight title between each other. In fact, the only other two men to hold the title the 6 years it existed were Ronnie Garvin and Paul Christie. While Randy and Lanny were the focus of the federation, it did feature many other stars such as Ronnie Garvin, Crusher Broomfield, Bob Orton Jr., Bob Roop, Rip Rogers, Ox Baker, Pistol Pez Watley, and the Devil's Duo with their manager, Izzy Slapowitz. Miss Elizabeth, who would later gain fame in the WWE, got her start in professional wrestling as an on-camera host of ICW's weekly TV show, where she also started her romance with Randy Savage. In 1984, the promotion closed down due to dwindling attendance, and its assets were bought by Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler. Due to the fans' knowledge of the extremely bitter rivalry between ICW and CWA, Randy Savage was able to migrate to the CWA and begin a memorable feud with Jerry Lawler that established Randy Savage as a world-class superstar. International Championship Wrestling held a variety of professional wrestling tournaments between 1980 and 1982 that were competed for by wrestlers that were part of their roster. The ICW Championship Tournament was a single elimination tournament to crown the first ever ICW television champion. It was held in the fall, with the finals occurring on September 9th, 1980. The ICW US Tag Team Championship Tournament was a one-night tag team tournament held in Johnson City, Tennessee on January 5th, 1982 for the vacant ICW United States Tag Team Championship. Paul Christie, the wrestler who had ended Randy Savage's final reign as ICW World Champion, started a new ICW when Poffo's promotion folded. He ran the promotion for a few years with little publicity or success before closing it down in the late 1980s. That was the untold story of International Championship Wrestling. Championship Wrestling from Florida was the corporate and brand name of the Tampa, Florida Wrestling Office. It remained in existence from 1949 until 1987, when it closed down. It is also referred to as Florida Championship Wrestling, as when Mike Graham tried to return to promoting, the rights to the original name had been acquired by an outside party, forcing him to use an alternative name. It was 1949 in Florida. While the Florida hurricane was causing $52 million in damage, Harry Truman was beginning his second term as U.S. President, cable television was born in the mountains of Pennsylvania, and cowboy Clarence P. Luttrell was opening the Tampa, Florida wrestling office, a former journeyman heel wrestler who once took a severe beating in a widely publicized boxing match with 40-something Jack Dempsey. Because of health reasons with Cowboy, Eddie Graham bought into the promotion in 1961 and took over completely in 1971. The office was a member of the National Wrestling Alliance during the entire CWF era, Eddie Graham serving as 2 terms as NWA president. CWF became a staple in many Southern households in the 1970s and 1980s, with Dusty Rhodes arguably its most noted headliner, his babyface turn beginning in 1973 against former partner Pac Song. The promotion competed against other syndicated shows on Saturday night like The Lawrence Welk Show and Solid Gold for years. The promotion thrived with such stars as NWA champion Lou Thez, Gene Kiniski, as well as Don Curtis, Sam Steamboat, The Great Malenko, Johnny Valentine, Hiro Matsuda, Bob Orton Sr., and later Bob Orton Jr., Chief Jay Strongbow, Wahoo McDaniel, Terry and Dory Funk Jr., Jack and Jerry Briscoe, Buddy Colt, Dusty Rhodes, Barry Windham, Mike Rotunda, Mike Graham, and Kevin Sullivan, whose cult-like army of darkness got tremendous heat from the fans and, in the words of the promotion's legendary commentator Gordon Soley, a host of others. Soley's deadpan interviewing style often contemplated the outlandish behavior and actions of Sullivan and his minions, bringing a legitimacy to the on-air segments no matter what depth Sullivan would descend to. Dusty Rhodes stands out among the noted performers because of the number of rivalries he had on air through most of CWF's broadcasting history. Well-known heels, newcomers, and babyfaces who turned heel during their tenure with CWF often sought out Rhodes to make their names in the territory. His rivals over the years included superstar Billy Graham, Ray Stevens, Ernie Ladd, Ivan Koloff, Ox Baker, Ron Bass, Kamala, Abdullah the Butcher, Ric Flair, his old Texas Outlaw partner Dick Murdoch, and of course Kevin Sullivan. When Eddie Graham committed suicide on Super Bowl Sunday in January 1985, responsibility for the office went to Hiro Matsuda and Duke Kiyomuka, both of whom bought in the 1960s. Other remaining owners were Mike Graham, Skip Gossett, Dusty Rhodes, and Buddy Colt. The promotion continued to lose money and merged with Jim Crockett Promotions in February 1987. Most of the stars had already gone to Jim Crockett or the WWF by that point. The CWF filmed and later taped its weekly TV wrestling show at the famed Sportatorium in Tampa, Florida. In reality, a small television studio with seating for a live audience of about 100 people, with the wrestling office and gym in the same building. CWF spin-off shows were Championship Wrestling Superstars, Global Wrestling, North Florida Championship Wrestling, United States Class Wrestling, American Championship Wrestling, and Southern Professional Wrestling. On March 2, 2006, it was announced that the CWF tape library was purchased by World Wrestling Entertainment for the DVD on Dusty Rhodes. In 2007, WWE revived the promotion as a development territory under the name Florida Championship Wrestling. In 2012, the promotion began operating under the NXT Wrestling banner, dropping all references to FCW and CWF. The Florida version of the NWA Brass Knuckles Championship was a secondary professional wrestling championship defended sporadically in the Florida territory. As its name suggests, the title was contested in matches in which the participants wore brass knuckles, and it existed from 1960 until the title was abandoned in 1984. Notable champions included the One Man Gang, Blackjack Mulligan, Dick Slater, Sonny King, Black Bart, Killer Carl Cox, Steve Kern, Rocky Johnson, Tarzan Tyler, Dusty Rhodes, Jack Briscoe, Paul Jones, Bearcat Wright, Boris Malenko, and Bobby Duncombe. The NWA Florida Television Championship was also a secondary title. It existed from 1970 until 1987. Notable champions from that era included James J. Dillon, Pat Patterson, Pedro Morales, Barry Windham, Don Morocco, Baron Von Raschke, Sweet Brown Sugar, and David Von Erich. The Florida version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship was a primary title for tag teams in CWF that was used between 1961 and 1969. CWF introduced their version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship in January 1961 when they introduced the Von Brauners as the NWA World Tag Team Champions. Records are unclear on how the Von Brauners became the champions, and it's possible that they were just simply billed as champions upon arrival. In 1969, CWF abandoned the NWA World Tag Team Championship with the Mask Infernos as the last champions. CWF later used the NWA North American Tag Team Championship, the NWA Southern Tag Team Championship, the NWA United States Tag Team Championship, and the NWA Florida Global Tag Team Championship. The Von Brauners hold the record for the most championship reigns, 6 in total, as well as the longest combined reigns with at least 540 days. The Von Brauners' first reign and the first reign of the championship lasted at least 196 days, with the longest individual reign. Eddie Graham held the championship on 7 occasions with various partners. The shortest individual reign lasted 9 days as Eddie Graham and Jose Lothario held it from October 25th till November 3rd, 1966. The NWA Florida Heavyweight Championship was a major title in CWF and is now the major title in NWA Florida Wrestling Alliance. It started in 1934, predating the formation of the NWA, and was abandoned in 1949. It was picked back up in 1966 by CWF and lasted until 1987 when the company was purchased by Jim Crockett Promotions. That was the untold story of championship wrestling from Florida. It was the early 1950s in New York. Whitey Ford and the New York Yankees were dominating every World Series. Bill Haley and the Comets' Rock Around the Clock record was topping the charts. The first commercial computer was produced in the United States. Capital Wrestling Corporation was founded by Jess McMahon and Toots Mondt, and in 1953 became a member of the National Wrestling Alliance. Capital Wrestling Corporation was the sanctioning body for the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, which for those that have been living under a rock for the past 40 years is the precursor for today's WWE. The National Wrestling Alliance recognized an undisputed NWA World Heavyweight Champion that went to several different professional wrestling promotions across the globe defending the title. The NWA generally promoted strong shooters as champions to give their sport credibility and guard against double-crossers. While doing strong business in the Midwest, these wrestlers attracted little interest along the Eastern Seaboard in the Capital Wrestling Corporation territory. And to top it off, in November 1954, Jess McMahon passed away. The 1927 Evening News described Jess McMahon as the greatest matchmaker and one of the first promoters to cross the color line by giving wrestlers of diverse cultural backgrounds equal opportunities at a time of racial divide. Jess was loved highly and respected by fans of all ethnic backgrounds. Mondt brought in Jess's son Vincent James. The younger McMahon and Mondt were very successful and soon controlled approximately 70% of the NWA's booking, largely due to their dominance in the heavily populated Northeast region. In 1961, the NWA board decided to put the championship on bleach blonde showman Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, who was an effective drawing card in the region. The rest of the NWA was unhappy with Mondt because he rarely allowed Rogers to wrestle outside the Northeast. Mondt and McMahon wanted Rogers to hold up the physical NWA World Heavyweight title, but Rogers was unwilling to sacrifice his $25,000 cash deposit on the championship belt. Rogers lost the NWA World Heavyweight Championship to Lou Thez in a one-fall match in front of 9,000 fans in Toronto, Ontario on January 24, 1963. This led to Mondt, McMahon, and the Capital Wrestling Corporation leaving the NWA in protest, creating the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in the process. In April that year, Rogers was awarded the new WWWF World Heavyweight Championship, supposedly winning a fictional tournament in Rio de Janeiro. He lost the championship to Bruno Sammartino a month later on May 17, 1963, after suffering a heart attack days before the match. To accommodate Rogers' condition, the match was booked to last under a minute. Notable wrestlers from this era included Haystacks Calhoun, Al Costello, Captain Lou Albano, Pat Barrett, Classy Freddie Blassie, Johnny Valentine, Bruno Sammartino, Arnold Skoland, Lord Littlebrook, and Johnny Powers. Bruno Sammartino would retain the title for 7 years, 8 months, and 1 day, making his the longest continuous world championship reign in men's wrestling history. Although Sammartino was the face of the WWWF, wrestlers such as superstar Billy Graham and Bob Backlund were also hugely popular. The Federation gained notoriety in the 1970s by holding their biggest shows at Shea Stadium or Madison Square Gardens and doing strong business across the entire Northeast region. They leveraged former but still popular wrestlers such as Captain Lou Albano, Grand Wizard of Wrestling Ernie Roth, and Classy Freddie Blassie to act as managers for Sammartino's heel opponents. Around this time, only fan-favorite wrestlers were allowed to have long championship reigns, such as Bruno Sammartino, Pedro Morales, and Bob Backlund, who all retained for more than 1 year each. The heel champions, such as Ivan Koloff and Stan Stasiak, were used to transition the championship from one wrestler to another, and they generally kept the title for no more than a single month-long program before dropping it to the next good guy. Superstar Billy Graham was the only heel character to keep his championship for longer than 1 month, as the WWWF felt it needed time to build Bob Backlund up as championship material. The WWWF was relatively conservative for promotions of its day, running its major arenas monthly rather than weekly or bi-weekly. Programs generally involved a babyface champion facing a heel challenger for 1 to 3 meetings in each scheduled town. For longer programs, a heel would often win the first match in a non-decisive manner, such as countout or via excessive blood loss. The champion would then retain in an ultra-violent blow-off match, such as a steel cage match or Texas death match. Unlike most of the NWA territories, the main event would occur in the middle of the show cards, allowing the company to build upon the match's finish in order to sell tickets for the next event. Reliable, popular workers such as Chief Jay Strongbow or Andre the Giant would then wrestle at the end of the show to send the crowd home happy. The WWWF also featured popular wrestlers based out of different territories, such as Dusty Rhodes, and retained the services of the most popular and highly paid wrestler at the time, Andre the Giant. Toots Mondt left the WWWF in the late 60s, and Vincent J. McMahon assumed complete control of the organization. After gaining a television program deal and turning preliminary wrestler Lou Albano into a manager for Sammartino's heel opponents, the WWWF was doing sell-out business. Later that year, the Mongols created controversy after they left the federation with the WWWF International Tag Team Championship. The title would be considered inactive as a result, until Luke Graham and Tarzan Tyler won a tournament to claim the championship. They then defeated the Mongols in November 1971, voiding any claim the Mongols had to the titles. In 1976, Vince McMahon Sr. sold tickets to a closed-circuit telecast of the Muhammad Ali vs. Antonio Inoki fight at Shea Stadium and drew a crowd of over 32,000. That night, the Ali and the Inoki fight would be the main event on a card that also featured Andre the Giant vs. boxer Chuck Wepner. Ali was reported to have been guaranteed $6 million, but the actual match failed to live up to the hype. At the annual meeting of the NWA in 1983, the McMahons and the Worldwide Wrestling Federation withdrew from the organization. By March 1979, for marketing purposes, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation was renamed the World Wrestling Federation. That same year, Vincent J. McMahon's son, Vincent K. McMahon, founded Titan Sports, originally in Massachusetts. In 1982, Titan Sports acquired Capitol's operations, effectively relocating its headquarters to Greenwich, Connecticut. In an attempt to make the WWF the premier wrestling promotion in the world, McMahon began an expansion that fundamentally changed the industry. In the end, Vince McMahon Sr. would never live to see his company grow from a territorial promotion to what it is now, a worldwide organization. He passed away on May 24, 1984 at 69 years old. By 1985, Titan moved to Stamford, Connecticut, then later changed its name to World Wrestling Federation Entertainment before finally becoming World Wrestling Entertainment in 2002. That was the untold story of the Capitol Wrestling Corporation. It was the early 1940s in Detroit. John Lee Hooker was hanging out in small blues clubs on Hastings Street. Ford was preparing to release its F-Series pickup truck. Edward Jeffries was mayor. and boxing referee Harry Light began promoting boxing and professional wrestling events throughout Michigan. In the aftermath of World War II, Harry Light established the Harry Light Wrestling offices as a vehicle for promoting professional wrestling in Detroit. In 1948, Light founded the National Wrestling Alliance along with Al Haft, Paul George, Orville Brown, Sam Muchnick, and Tony Stretcher. The 6 promoters agreed to divide the United States into regional territories within which they would not compete with one another, and to recognize a single world heavyweight champion who would travel the country wrestling in each territory. By the 1950s, Light, along with his business partners Jack Britton and Bert Ruby, controlled the professional wrestling industry in Detroit. Big Time Wrestling on Channel 7 was one of the most popular programs airing in Detroit. Light retired in 1958 and passed away in 1971, with control of the territory passing to Jim Barnett and Johnny Doyle. Barnett and Doyle formed a holding company, the Barnett-Doyle Corporation, and secured investment from backers such as Frank Tunney. Barnett and Doyle were originally outlaw promoters, but the territory later rejoined the National Wrestling Alliance. In 1964, Barnett and Doyle sold professional wrestler Ed the Sheik Farhat and his father-in-law the promotion, along with the rights to promote wrestling in the Cobo area, for $50,000, forming Worldwide Sports as a holding company. Farhat booked himself as a promotion's top wrestler, winning the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship Detroit version 12 times. By the 1960s, the promotion was airing 2 or 3 television programs per week and staging weekly house shows at the Cobo Arena. In the early 1970s, the promotion faced competition from Dick the Bruiser and Wilbur Snyder's newly established All-Star Championship Wrestling promotion, which utilized talents from the Indiana-based World Wrestling Association. After several wrestlers defected to ASCW, Big Time Wrestling responded by bringing in talent from other NWA territories. ASCW stopped promoting in 1974, and Dick the Bruiser joined Big Time Wrestling, facing the Sheik in a series of brawls. During the 1970s, Big Time Wrestling helped popularize hardcore wrestling. Notable performers included Fritz Von Erich, the Mighty Igor, Dusty Rhodes, Ernie Roth, the Sheik, Ray St. Clair, George Steele, the Stomper, Johnny Valentine, Killer Kowalski, Ernie Ladd, Lord Athol Layton, Mark Lewin, Tony Marino, and the Blimp. The promotion's fortunes began to decline in the mid-1970s due to a combination of the 1973-1975 recession, no shows by wrestlers, and audiences becoming tired of the same old booking. As audiences dwindled, events were relocated to the Michigan State Fairgrounds Coliseum and then again to Lincoln Park Community Center, just outside of Detroit. The promotion was wound up in 1980. Professional wrestling in Detroit remained subdued until the World Wrestling Federation began promoting shows in the city as part of the 1980s professional wrestling boom. Big Time Wrestling was also the subject of the 1985 mockumentary I Like to Hurt People. The Detroit version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship was the top-ranked professional wrestling championship for tag teams in the Detroit, Michigan-based promotion Big Time Wrestling, sometimes referred to as NWA Detroit. As a member of the National Wrestling Alliance, each promotion was entitled to promote their own local version of the championship, as the NWA bylaws did not restrict its use in the way they restricted the NWA World Heavyweight Championship to one nationally recognized champion. Because individual NWA members, referred to as NWA territories, were allowed to create their own version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship, at least 22 different versions existed between 1949 and 1991. The first championship team recognized in Detroit was that of the Tolos brothers, Chris and John, who were introduced as champions around February 1965, as having recently won the championship, though no records of a tournament exist. Kurt Von Hess and Carl Von Schatz held the championship 5 times as a team, the record for the 25-year history of this version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship, while Fred Curry holds a record for the most overall reigns, with different partners. The shortest reign belongs to Lou Klein and Ed George, as Klein announced his retirement right after the match, making their reign only minutes long. The longest reign lasted at least 196 days as the Fabulous Kangaroos won the championship on December 18, 1971 and held it until May 1972. Notable teams included Chris and John Tolos, Nikolai and Boris Volkov, Bobo Brazil and Sailor Art Thomas, Fred Curry and Billy Red Lions, and the Fabulous Kangaroos. The NWA Detroit United States Heavyweight Championship was a version of the NWA United States Heavyweight title contested in big-time wrestling. It was known as the Chicago version from 1953 until 1959 and was later renamed the Detroit version from 1959 until 1980. That was the untold story of big-time wrestling, NWA Detroit. The original National Wrestling Federation was a wrestling promotion based in Buffalo, New York, and owned and operated by promoter Pedro Martinez. It ran from 1970 to 1974. The promotion was then revived in 1986 by Robert Raskin. The revived promotion closed in 1994. Pedro Martinez owned the original National Wrestling Federation, which operated from 1970 to 1974. The NWF Heavyweight Championship was created by Pedro Martinez and co-founded by Johnny Powers for the NWF promotion in New York in 1970 against the NWA, but it recognized the world champion. The title was mainly defended in the New York Eastern Canada area until then champion Johnny Powers took the belt with him on a tour of Japan with Tokyo Pro Wrestling. Powers would eventually lose the title to Antonio Inoki, who would take the belt with him when he founded New Japan Pro Wrestling. Some of the talent appearing on the NWF shows from 1970 to 1974 included Johnny Powers, Superfly Jimmy Snuka, Bobo Brazil, Ernie Ladd, Abdullah the Butcher, Dusty Rhodes, Dick Murdoch, Johnny Valentine, Wahoo McDaniels, Tiger Jeet Singh, Haystacks Calhoun, the Rougeaus, Crazy Luke Graham, Stan the Man Stasiak, and Dominic DiNucci. The NWF North American Heavyweight Championship was a secondary singles title in the promotion. The title started in 1968 as a National Wrestling Alliance title named the NWA North American Heavyweight Championship Buffalo Cleveland version until the NWF was founded in 1970. The NWF would close in 1974 and the title migrated to New Japan Pro Wrestling. The title was then abandoned in 1981. As mentioned, Johnny Powers co-founded the National Wrestling Federation. He was the NWF World Heavyweight Champion and was the star of Championship Wrestling with Johnny Powers. He was the only wrestler then and to since have a television show named after him, other than Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling. He was NWF North American Champion 7 times and NWF World Champion 3 times. In an interesting side note, Powers wrestled Bruno Sammartino on 6 different occasions for the Worldwide Wrestling Federation title in the mid-60s. He also wrestled NWA Champion Lou Thez, Gene Kiniski, and WWA Champ Vern Gagne. In 1973, Powers sold the NWF to Antonio Inoki and New Japan Pro Wrestling. Powers was defeated by Antonio Inoki for the NWF World Heavyweight Championship December 10, 1973 in Tokyo. The NWF Heavyweight Championship and the NWF North American Heavyweight Championship were later used by New Japan Pro Wrestling as its main titles until 1981. Inoki became the wrestler most associated with the titles due to his high-profile defenses, defeating the likes of Stan Hansen, Andre the Giant, Tiger Jeet Singh, and Ernie Ladd. Recognized as a 4-time NWF heavyweight champion between the years of 1973 and 1983, Inoki was champion for all but 6 months. Inoki's 4th reign was actually due to the decision to hold up the championship, following a defense against Stan Hansen on April 17, 1981, that ended in no contest. Inoki later regained the title on April 23, 1981 by defeating Hansen in a rematch. He retired the NWF title immediately after the match due to his desire to enter the International Wrestling Grand Prix League. The NWF Heavyweight Championship and the NWF North American Heavyweight Championship was used by New Japan Pro Wrestling as its main titles until 1981. In 1986, former basketball coach Robert Raskin purchased the Allentown, Pennsylvania-based Continental Wrestling Alliance from D.C. Drake and named it the National Wrestling Federation. Raskin changed the name of the CWA to the National Wrestling Federation in 1986, and he spared no expense in bringing top talent that had previously worked for the WWF or NWA. Names such as Sergeant Slaughter, Jimmy Snuka, the Wild Samoans, Bruiser Brody, the Honky Tonk Man, Jules Strongbow, Wendy Richter, Ivan Koloff, Rocky Johnson, Nikolai Volkov, the Tonga Kid, Abdullah the Butcher, Dr. D. David Schultz, Colonel De Beers, Tom Brandy, David Sammartino, and even Stan Hansen. The organization revived the NWF Heavyweight Championship and also created an NWF Women's Championship. Under the direction of Raskin, the National Wrestling Federation grew rapidly, using wrestlers who were formerly under contract with the World Wrestling Federation and the National Wrestling Alliance. Raskin spared no expense in making the product a watchable alternative to the wrestling shows which were currently on television. Drake, who was the champion, also headed up the booking and television production ends of the business. DC Drake won a tournament to crown the first NWF Heavyweight Championship in 1986. At this point in time, DC Drake would begin using a hardcore style inside the ring and spill buckets of blood in matches with Jules Strongbow among others. Although nothing new, Drake sparked a hardcore take on the entire federation, including many specialty matches such as Indian strap matches, dog collar matches, steel cage matches, and one of the first women's steel cage matches featuring Wendy Richter and Heidi Lee Morgan. Raskin felt that the NWF should move the television tapings from the Eastern Pennsylvania Hall to various locations around the East Coast. Matches were taped at arenas in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and other locations. Raskin also hired a young Paul Heyman to handle color commentary on the TV show. Paul Heyman was hired by the promotion as the on-air announcer. One of Paul's first official runs in the business took place in NWF. Some of the tag teams involved in the NWF included the Nasty Boys, the Wild Samoans, Buddy Rose and Doug Summers, the Fantastics, and the Midnight Rockers. Drake and Raskin also decided to put more emphasis on the NWF Women's Division. As the Women's Division became established, Wendy Richter was defeated in a questionable fashion in Madison Square Gardens by the Fabulous Moolah and left the World Wrestling Federation. She entered the NWF and quickly captured the title from Heidi Lee Morgan. Raskin, seeing the organization expanding, merged with Creative Entertainment, a sports and entertainment promotional organization from Philadelphia. The move proved to be a smart one, as Creative Entertainment was able to book matches for the NWF all across the country. The television show expanded to sports channels and broadcast stations across the country and appeared in foreign markets in Europe, South and Central America, and even Asia. As the company grew, creative differences began to split the organization, and several in the front office left to pursue other ventures. As the capital investment stopped, the television product was halted. The promotion closed in 1994. Many consider the NWF to be an inspirational precursor to Tri-State Wrestling and ECW. That's the untold story of the National Wrestling Federation. NWA Hollywood sometimes referred to as NWA Los Angeles, was a professional wrestling promotion located in Los Angeles that promoted matches throughout Southern California. It was founded in 1958 as the North American Wrestling Alliance, a member of the National Wrestling Alliance. It broke away from the NWA in 1959 and in 1961 was renamed Worldwide Wrestling Associates. In 1968, it rejoined the NWA and adopted its final name, NWA Hollywood. In 1942, Frank Garbutt, vice president of the Los Angeles Athletic Club, hired former California State Athletic Commission Inspector Alva Cal Eaton as the promoter of the Grand Olympic Auditorium at the advice of his secretary, Eileen LaBelle. Eaton and LaBelle married in 1948, and over the following years, the couple became a major professional wrestling and boxing promoter in Southern California. By the early 1950s, the Eatons, along with Hugh Nichols, Johnny Doyle, and Mike Hirsch, collectively known as the California Combine, dominated professional wrestling in Southern California, leading to a United States Department of Justice antitrust investigation in 1955 and 1956. On July 24, 1957, Lou Thez defeated Edouard Carpentier under controversial circumstances to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, the principal championship recognized by the National Wrestling Alliance. The decision was challenged by some members of the NWA, who continued to recognize Carpentier as the World Heavyweight Champion. In 1958, the Eatons created the North American Wrestling Alliance as the new vehicle for promoting professional wrestling in Los Angeles. Eaton at the time was still a member of the NWA, but had not paid dues since 1955. In October 1959, Eaton and LaBelle withdrew from the NWA, recognizing Edouard Carpentier as the inaugural World Heavyweight Champion, backdated to June 14, 1957, when Carpentier had originally won the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. The promotion was renamed Worldwide Wrestling Associates in 1961. The promotion ran events throughout Southern California, with the Grand Olympic Auditorium at its base. Bookers included Jewel Strongbow, Freddie Blassie, Mr. Moto, and Gory Guerrero. The promotion developed a working relationship with the Japan Wrestling Association and New Japan Pro Wrestling, resulting in many talent exchanges. Eileen Eaton introduced a system of paying wrestlers a proportion of the gate rather than a guaranteed fee, boosting profits and encouraging wrestlers to help promote the events. The promotion also pioneered the use of closed-circuit television to show matches to fans who were unable to secure tickets for live events, an early precursor to the pay-per-view model that emerged in the 1980s. In 1963, WWA World Heavyweight Champion Bearcat Wright faced Freddie Blassie in a bout that Wright was scripted to lose. Instead, Wright headbutted Blassie, dazing him, and then legitimately pinned him. Wright was subsequently stripped of the championship, which was then awarded to Edouard Carpentier. Eaton died on January 10, 1966, with Eileen's son from a previous marriage, Mike LaBelle, taking over on behalf of his mother, who was then a major figure in boxing. On August 18, 1968, Bell rejoined the NWA, renaming the promotion NWA Hollywood Wrestling. The WWA World Heavyweight Championship was abandoned, and the promotion began recognizing NWA World Heavyweight Championship once more. In August 1971, promotion set a national gate record for an event headed by a bout between Freddie Blassie and John Tolos that sold over $140,000 worth of tickets. Notable wrestlers included Chris Adams, Buddy Austin, Freddie Blassie, Lord James Blears, Dino Bravo, Edouard Carpentier, The Destroyer, Rick Drassen, Terry Funk, Billy Graham, Chavo Guerrero Sr., Gene LaBelle, Don Leo Jonathan, Mil Mascaros, Ray Mendoza, Pedro Morales, Mr. Moto, Roddy Piper, Victor Rivera, The Sheik, Dennis Stamp, Lou Thez, John Tolos, Dale Valentine, and Bearcat Wright. The NWA America's Heavyweight Championship was the top singles championship in the NWA's Los Angeles territory, known officially as the NWA Hollywood Wrestling, from 1968 until the promotion closed in 1982. The title was first established in 1967 as a secondary championship in the NWA Hollywood's predecessor, Worldwide Wrestling Associates. Although the name of the title implies it was defended throughout North, Central, and South America, it was rarely defended outside Southern California. As a result, the title was essentially a regional title rather than a national one. A number of NWA-affiliated promoters at various points over the years have used their own regional versions or variations of the national championship for purpose of giving crowds the idea that the company was larger than it actually was, or that the company was the biggest or most successful within the ranks of the National Wrestling Alliance. The NWA Beat the Champ Television Championship was a secondary title defended in Johnny Doyle's NWA Los Angeles from 1951 to 1959. The title is defended in the same area during the 1960s under promoters Gene and Mike LaBelle. The WWA International Television Tag Team Championship was a tag team title in the Worldwide Wrestling Associate from the title's formation in 1954 until 1964, when it was replaced with the WWA World Tag Team Championship. The NWA America's Tag Team Championship was a tag team title in NWA Hollywood. The championship began as the WWA World Tag Team Championship for Worldwide Wrestling Associates in 1964. However, when WWA became an NWA affiliate on October 1, 1968, its name was changed to NWA Hollywood Wrestling, and the title was renamed the NWA America's Tag Team Championship in January 1969. The title served as the top tag team championship in the promotion until 1979, when it was relegated to serve as a secondary tag team title since the company created its own regional version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship. The championship lasted until the promotion closed on December 26, 1982. The Los Angeles version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship was the main tag team title of the North America Wrestling Alliance. The championship was the first of at least 17 championships to use that name between 1949 and 1992, as the NWA Board of Directors allowed each territory to create its own version of the NWA World Tag Team Championship if so desired. In 1957, there were at least 13 different versions of the NWA World Tag Team Championship recognized in the United States. The first version of the Los Angeles NWA World Tag Team Championship was created in 1949, less than a year after the NWA itself was founded. At the time, tag team wrestling was popular on the West Coast, leading to the local NWA promoters Hugh Nichols and Johnny Doyle creating the first ever NWA World Tag Team Championship when on July 14, 1949, they announced the Dusick family as the first champions. The NWA Board of Directors dictated that all NWA territories recognize only one NWA Heavyweight Championship, but allowed each territory to crown its own World Tag Team Championship, making each championship a regional championship despite the name. The Los Angeles territory promoted its NWA World Tag Team Championship for 11 years, with Ben and Mike Sharp being the last champions of the era. The Dusicks were the only team to hold the championship twice in that period of time. The longest reign of the first era belonged to Guy Brunetti and Joe Tangera, who held the championship for at least 277 days. After the Los Angeles version was abandoned, the local promoters recognized the San Francisco version in subsequent years. By the 1970s, the San Francisco territory had been taken over by Mike and Gene LaBelle's NWA Hollywood Wrestling. In June 1970, the Twin Devils were billed as the NWA World Tag Team Champions. Records are not clear for how the Twin Devils became the champions, since no records of a tournament had ever been found. It is possible they were simply awarded the championship when the LaBelles decided to reintroduce the NWA World Tag Team Championship. Los Brazos were the last holder of the championship, as NWA Hollywood Wrestling closed in December 1982. From that point on, the NWA Mid-Atlantic version was the only active NWA World Tag Team Championship left. NWA Hollywood Wrestling continued to operate until folding on December 26, 1982. In March 1983, the World Wrestling Federation began promoting shows in its former territory. The St. Louis Wrestling Club was a professional wrestling promotion based in St. Louis, Missouri. It was owned and operated by Sam Muchnick. The promotion was a flagship member of the National Wrestling Alliance and promoted primarily in the St. Louis area. It was referred to within the business as the St. Louis office of the NWA. Wrestling at the Chase was a professional wrestling television series of local and national historical importance in the field of television wrestling. The show was recorded in St. Louis, Missouri on KPLR TV Channel 11. The show was the brainchild of Sam Muchnick and Harold Koppler, who owned KPLR and the old Chase Park Plaza Hotel. The two were together on an airplane in 1958 and wondered how they could bring wrestling into the St. Louis area homes. The original series began on May 23, 1959 and ran until September 10, 1983. KPLR TV Channel 11 produced and televised the matches, which were held at the Chase Park Plaza Hotel in St. Louis Central West End and televised at 10 a.m. Conveniently, the KPLR studios were in an adjacent connecting building. Initially, the matches were broadcast live on Saturday nights and repeated on Sunday mornings. This production method was later replaced by live-to-tape system, meaning that while the performances recorded for later broadcast, they were shot entirely in one take as if airing live, so that no allowances were made for unseen or unscripted developments or events. The show produced approximately 1,100 episodes over its 24 years. On a few occasions, for matches that would attract larger crowds, the show would be recorded in the Kale Auditorium or in the St. Louis Arena. Although the St. Louis Wrestling Club began by recording one show at a time, in the early 1970s they were recording 3 shows at a time on Sunday mornings. Admission to the recordings was free, and the room in which the matches took place seated 900 fans. Joe Garagiola was the initial play-by-play commentator. When he left in 1963, Don Cunningham took his place. The following year, Cunningham died and was replaced with George Abel. He was joined in 1972 by Larry Mattisett, who at the time was also a part-time police officer in Belleville, Illinois. Ring announcers included John Curley, Eddie Gromacki, and Joe Garagiola's brother, Mickey Garagiola. The show featured many of the most famous wrestlers in the NWA. Participants included Ric Flair, Harley Race, Cowboy Bob Orton, Dick the Bruiser, Bruiser Brody, Gene Kiniski, Lou Thez, Dory Funk Jr., and Ted DiBiase. The St. Louis Wrestling Club, as part of the National Wrestling Alliance, recognized the NWA World Heavyweight Champion as their world title, and the champion would frequently tour the St. Louis territory. Outside of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, the territory recognized or promoted the following titles at some point in time: the NWA Missouri Heavyweight Championship, the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship, and the NWA Central States Heavyweight Championship. The Central States Heavyweight title was the forerunner to the Missouri Heavyweight Championship. The title was created after a controversy on January 28, 1972, where Pat O'Connor defeated Harley Race for the Central States title. When promoters refused to recognize the title change and kept promoting Harley Race as the Central States champion, Muchnick stopped recognizing the Central States title, opting instead to create the Missouri Heavyweight title. Sam Muchnick gained a reputation as being a fair and honest promoter, which was uncommon in the early days of professional wrestling. In another anomaly, the St. Louis Wrestling Club did not recognize a tag team championship, focusing mainly on singles, matches, and angles. Muchnick did not operate St. Louis as a territory, preferring only to run monthly cards at the Kiel Auditorium and the St. Louis Arena. Popular wrestling stars featured by the St. Louis Wrestling Club included Ric Flair, Harley Race, Dick the Bruiser, Gene Kiniski, Lou Thez, and Ted DiBiase. Undercard spots were filled by wrestlers from Central States Wrestling, as Muchnick did not maintain a permanent roster. In 1982, Muchnick retired and the St. Louis Wrestling Club was purchased by Bob Geigel and others. Geigel also owned Central States Wrestling. Geigel found himself in competition with Muchnick, former announcer and general manager Larry Matysik, who felt that Geigel and Reese's booking strategy did not fit the town and ran an opposing promotion. Larry Matysik and KPLR director Ted Koppler would both ink deals with Vince McMahon in 1983, giving the WWF a foothold in the St. Louis area and the traditional Wrestling at the Chase time slot. By 1985, the WWF and Hulk Hogan were gaining huge popularity in the St. Louis area, and the organization began to lose profits. In 1985, the St. Louis office was purchased by Jim Crockett Promotions and was absorbed into what soon became World Championship Wrestling. That's the untold story of the St. Louis Wrestling Club.